The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Story 1. I've been homeless for the last 16 years. This is why. I live on the streets. When they meet me, people wonder why. I've made up all sorts of lies, and occasionally told the truth. Even rarer, somebody believes me. I've finally decided to set it down in writing, to record it for after I pass on, and so that I don't have to repeat the story. Next time somebody asks, they can simply read this. Most people just walk past a homeless person. Some will give spare change. That's rarer these days, with fewer people carrying cash. But there are enough kind people willing to go into shops for me that I get by, barely. And even more rarely, somebody will stop to talk to me. Most homeless people I know don't ask. We've all experienced trauma of some kind, and we generally don't like to talk about it. My story is unusual though. I'm very articulate, and I'm fluent in English, French, Mandarin, German and Yoruba, with a decent understanding of Swedish, Korean and Swahili. I'm also very good at talking my way out of situations and persuading people to find common ground. With all these skills, people who talk to me ask, why aren't I, for example, a well-paid translator or diplomat? The answer is simple, because those jobs take place indoors. For the last 7 years, I've lived on the streets of a city in West Africa. I won't name it. I get by on the charity of others and doing gardening jobs, and a bit of bricklaying in the early stages of construction. At least, I have to bail on those jobs when houses are nearing completion, as you'll see. But I grew up in northern England. My parents are fairly wealthy, and I attended a private school, not one you'll likely have heard of. But my education was excellent. My life was going very well. I had plenty of friends, and I was getting good grades in science. French and Latin. I had won a few minor piano competitions, and enjoyed skiing holidays in Switzerland most years. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm boasting. That's not my intention. I'm just presenting my life as it was, so that you fully appreciate the contrast, and so that you understand I had no reason to run from it. You see, just after my 13th birthday, after school on a Friday in June, I was supposed to meet some friends in a coffee shop in town. I was there first, and feeling very grown up and wanting to show off when they arrived, I ordered a latte. So there I was, sitting alone with my coffee, scrolling through Twitter, when a woman approached me. She was 40, maybe 50 years old, with long dark hair, and wore what looked like it would have been a very nice business suit 10 years earlier. Now it was ragged, with holes and dark stains. She sat herself down opposite me and stared at me. I tried to ignore her at first. After a minute or so, I looked up and, with an annoyed tone, asked, "Yeah, what do you want?" Her response was just 3 words, "I'm so sorry." And then she reached over and touched my hand, stood up, and walked away. I'd never seen her before, and I haven't seen her again since. Now this, of course, puzzled me. She probably had me confused with somebody else. I told myself. It was a weird encounter, sure, but it was over, and it was at least a good story to tell my friends whenever they turned up. I was probably a bit more rattled than I admitted to myself, and I had another sip of my coffee and stood up to go to the toilet. 10 meters walk to the toilet, and that was the last time I was ever in England. I pushed open the toilet door, walked through, and was hit in the face by freezing snow. I don't know where I was. Back then, in shock, I turned around to go back through the door, but there was no door there. Instead, I was in a field of white. It took me a moment to realize that it was a snowstorm, and that I was outside. I don't think I panicked. I didn't understand what had happened or how, but I calmly assessed the situation. I was outside, in the cold and the snow, wearing my summer school uniform, shorts and all, with no idea where the nearest shelter was. I could figure out what had happened later. For now, I needed to survive. Looking around, visibility was not as bad as I'd feared. It was daytime. The snow was falling straight down, rather than the storm I'd assumed at first, and I could make out a neat line of trees in the distance. That probably meant a road, and a road meant civilization. So off I headed, across what seemed to be a farmer's field, and in 5 minutes I was indeed on a road. There were no signs that I could make out, so I picked a direction at random and started walking. After about half an hour I saw a light in the distance. I'd been shivering for some time, but I felt alert, so didn't think I was at immediate risk of hypothermia. I kept going, and soon arrived at a small cottage with lights on in the downstairs windows. A man answered my earnest knocks on the front door. He spoke a few words in a language I didn't know, and I pushed into the house, wanting to get in from the cold before explaining myself. And then I was on a beach. It took a moment to get over the shock of the sweltering heat. I blinked in the bright midday sun and looked around as my eyes started to adjust. I heard the sounds of people splashing in the water and generally having fun. Tu vas bien? Tu vas bien? A dark-skinned man in shorts and t-shirt was running towards me, asking if I was okay. I suppose I looked quite bewildered and out of place, and was probably the only person nearby still shivering, still confused, but relieved that he spoke French, a language I understood fairly well. I looked at him and tried to explain what was happening, but truthfully, I didn't know what was happening, and I just stared at him dumbstruck. He introduced himself as Louis. I managed to stammer out a "Where am I?" to which he replied that I was on a beach near Port-au-Prince. With me still barely able to articulate myself, Louis offered his help. He asked where my parents were, and when I couldn't answer, he led me to his car, saying that he could drive me to his house and we could figure things out from there. I've since learned that this was a very unwise move. Port-au-Prince, in Haiti, is one of the most crime-ridden cities on the planet. Murders and kidnappings are common, and there is a good chance Louis intended to traffic me. But I didn't realize that at the time, and I certainly wasn't thinking straight. I followed Louis up the beach, where he led me to a small car and opened the passenger door for me. I climbed into the car and fell quite hard onto the tarmac of a town in the early evening. Now bear in mind that I was 13 years old at the time. In the span of about 2 hours, I'd been accosted by a strange woman, trekked through snow in my shorts, led up a sweltering beach by a stranger, and to top it off, I now had a severely bruised behind. So I think my response to these events was entirely reasonable, given the circumstances. I cried. I looked around, found an out-of-the-way alleyway, hid myself behind some bins, and cried myself to sleep. Somebody woke me by talking loudly. I opened my eyes to see 2 police, a white man and white woman, standing over me. I knew German only enough to identify the language, not to understand what they were saying, but as I stood up in the chill of the early morning, I suppose they saw my school uniform, and the woman started speaking English. Apparently somebody had seen me there, a child sleeping rough, and called the police. The policewoman was very kind. She asked a lot of questions. Had I lost my school tour group? Where was I staying? Did I know my parents' phone number? I mumbled half answers to her questions, and her colleague motioned behind them to the police car I now saw at the end of the alleyway. It was only now that I realized what was happening. Doors were cursed, for me at least. If I tried to get into the police car, who knows where I would end up. For a split second I considered trying to explain things to them, before settling on, again, the only reasonable course of action. It's hard to run from the police, especially when they know the city and you don't. But I was still quite small, and I got lucky. I ran down the alley, turned left into a smaller alley, and saw a chain link fence a short distance along. A hole had been torn through the bottom, probably by somebody doing something just like me, and I dived down and crawled through. My school blazer caught on the fence, and I struggled to escape. The police had almost caught me by the time I managed to wriggle out of it, and I ran off, leaving my blazer behind. Good riddance, I thought. It made me far too identifiable anyway. I ran for maybe half an hour, ripping my tie off, now just dressed in grey shorts and white shirt. I looked a bit less like an English schoolboy. It was Saturday, and I was just another German kid out looking for his friends. Germans don't go to school on Saturday mornings, right? I wondered. Whatever the case, I didn't find any more trouble that morning. I still had $30 for coffee and shopping, and I followed the crowd until I found a small street market. One stall owner was happy to take my $30 for a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a plain jumper, and gave me €10 to buy a small lunch. I'm sure I was ripped off, but didn't really feel I had much choice. To answer the police's question, no, I didn't know my parents' numbers, and my phone was out of charge anyway. I needed a plan. I walked around town, which I learned was called Passau, and found an out-of-the-way bridge near the river. I decided to stay here, at least this evening. It was still early, but I was exhausted and just needed to rest. After the insanity of only, I realized, 24 hours. It was getting dark when I was aroused from dozing. I was sat against a wall in a 90-degree corner when somebody found me. After a similar exchange to the one I'd had that morning, he spoke in broken English. Victor was 16 and had been on the streets of Passau for about a month. His mum had left years before, and his dad had kicked him out of his home when he found out Victor was gay. I hadn't realized that sort of thing still happened. I suppose I had until that day lived a, pardon the pun, sheltered life. Victor was bigger than me and knew the city. He hadn't lived on the streets that long, but he was far more streetwise than I was, and he showed me how to survive. Over the next few months I learned where to steal food, where to beg, where the driest shelters were, and even how to pickpocket. Passau has a small homeless community, but a close one, and I got to know some people very well. It's fair to say by the time my 14th birthday rolled around, I was much more aware and capable. I learned German and practiced my French with a fellow migrant. I learned how to repair clothes and how to haggle with street vendors. I was still small for my age and found that I could wriggle into and hide in very tight spaces. In short, I proved myself to be useful to the homeless community of Passau, useful enough that others were very happy to indulge my little eccentricities and would go into shops for me when I needed to buy something. I got blankets and a sleeping bag for winter, and Victor would even charge my phone for me in coffee shops and pubs. It wasn't the life I was used to, but it was a life, and I had companionship. This all changed after I'd been in Germany just over a year. It was early evening, about an hour before kickoff at the European Championship final. Germany was about to play Spain, and there were plenty of people in the pubs getting drunk. Easy pickings for a thief. Victor and I had been working together for a year, and we carried out our well-rehearsed routine. We hung around a busy street until I saw two men come out of a pub, one of them putting his wallet in his back pocket as he left. Perfect. I signaled to Victor and started walking behind them. After a few moments, Victor bumped into him from the side, giving me the opportunity to lift his wallet. But his friend had turned his head to look behind him at just the wrong moment. He shouted, and the two of them turned to me. I ran, and Victor ran the other way, but the two men ignored him. I had a head start and thought I could outrun them, but one was gaining on me. In a split second, I decided that it would be easier to hide in a crowd, and ran for the door of the packed pub the two men had just left. I pushed the door open and hurtled through it. I arrived in Naning at night. Of course, I didn't know this at the time, but it was a fairly busy street, and I saw the Chinese characters on street signs. I won't go into a blow-by-blow account of my time there, which lasted about a year and a half, but in many respects it was similar to my time in Germany. In a way, I was getting used to this. Living on the streets is more or less the same in any country. Nanjing is a much larger city than Passau, and quite prosperous, but every city has its down and outs. I sought out the homeless, And while it took me a while longer than in Germany, I learned the language and culture of the place. If you Google it, you might think Nanjing is pretty safe. For the most part, that's true. But sleeping on the street is no safer there than anywhere else. I found safety in a street gang, putting the skills I'd learned in petty theft and pickpocketing to use. People come and go on the streets, but I ran with a group of 5 or 6 younger people while I was there. Even having a bit of a thing with Yihan, a girl a couple of years older than me, we would do what we called hit and run. We'd all accost somebody out alone, steal their wallet, and run in different directions. The others met up in an abandoned warehouse some way out from the center of town, and they got used to my weird insistence on staying outside and sleeping elsewhere. Nanjing has a heavier police presence than Passau, but my colleagues knew where they didn't go, and I did quite well, until one night in March. We were stalking a couple of drunk men in their 30s, and were about to make our practice move when another group arrived to do the same. I saw the situation developing and signaled my people to move out. Our competitors followed us down a side street. They clearly wanted a fight, and 2 of my friends did as well. I was happy to call it a night, and managed to talk them down from a confrontation, when Yi Chen, who was always a bit trigger-happy, threw a punch at one of the others. 3 of them pulled knives from their coats. One stabbed Yi Chen in the gut, and the others went for the rest of us. I ran. I was the fastest in our gang, but one of them was faster than me, and he nearly caught me. Seeing no other option, I legged it towards the main street and made my way to a shop. The staff were just closing up, but I didn't need to get in there. I just needed to pass the threshold. I made it through the door. This time I landed in Sweden, in the middle of the countryside. It was early afternoon and sunny, and a few drivers offered me a lift along the way, though obviously I declined. I was, in a way, starting to feel quite confident now. I'd relocated twice, and felt that I knew what to do. Sweden is a nice place, even for the homeless, especially if you're young and white. Strangers were generally kind, and I did well there. However, it can get very cold on the streets in winter, and when snow started to fall, I realized I wasn't likely to survive until spring. So in November, for the first time, voluntarily, I walked through a shop door and into another country. It didn't help. I judged that it was a long way to a city, and learned later that I was correct. So I decided to introduce myself to the farmers. They spoke barely any English, and I didn't yet speak any Swahili, but I managed to persuade the family that ran the farm to let me work for them. I'm sure they didn't really understand my motivations. A posh white English boy asking only for food in exchange for his labor, choosing to sleep outside, but they were friendly and happy with the arrangement. Over the next 2 years, I learned how the farm worked, built up my muscles. I'm still small and wiry, but strong, and proved myself to be an able worker. I picked coffee beans, milked cows, fixed fences, and acquired a decent tan. I even occasionally made the journey to a nearby market town, sitting in the back of one of the flatbed trucks. I was certainly a curiosity to the locals, but I was treated well. I would happily have stayed on that Kenyan farm for life. But after 2 years, something happened. The father of the household was off at the market town, and the rest of us were working the fields. I was bringing several baskets of coffee beans to the barn, and I heard shouting, "Masada! Masada! Help! Help!" The mother of the household, Anissa, had fallen in the kitchen. From outside, I could tell that her leg was bad. It was bleeding severely, and I think I could see bones sticking out. It was rare that there was just one person in the farmhouse, but it did happen. The closest help was probably at least 10 minutes away, and Anissa was bleeding too fast. I was the only one who could help, but I needed to get in there, somehow. Obviously the door was out of the question, but the kitchen window was wide open. Were windows safe? The answer, it turned out, was no. I hope Anissa got the help she needed, though I doubt it. But the last I saw of her, as I swung a leg into the kitchen, was an expression of abject terror, and then she and the farmhouse disappeared, replaced in an instant with the nighttime streets of Seoul. Again I had to start over, and again I had to learn a new language. English isn't well spoken in Korea, and it took me some time before I could get on. I made few friends and supported myself largely by stealing and pickpocketing. Without the kind of network I'd built up in Germany and China, things were more difficult. I got caught a few times and escaped before anything serious happened, until after about a year, I guess that the police had had a few reports of street thefts in my area. I noticed an increased police presence, and one day I just got sloppy. A couple were having coffee outside a cafe at lunchtime. The man's wallet was on the table between them, and I was hungry. I pulled my hoodie over my face, ran, and grabbed the wallet. While I was running away, I pulled the cash out, throwing the wallet on the ground. Then 10 minutes later, the police found me. I'd found another cafe with outdoor service. It wasn't far enough away, and I guess I hadn't hidden my face as well as I thought. I wasn't in a tourist area, and it was pretty easy to identify the only white man around, especially as I was wearing the same clothes. I saw two policemen walking towards me and started to run, but this time they were faster. They tackled me to the ground and bundled me into their patrol car. It was dark, too dark to see anything. At first I assumed I was on the other side of the world, at night, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was underground. I was in a vast cavern. There was minimal light, coming from a few burning torches in the distance. The ground was rough but solid, and the air was chilly, but no colder than the average night on the street in most towns. I could make out very little at first, and decided to head toward the torches while I figured out what my new situation was. As I got closer, I realized the torches surrounded a pit, and I could make out people under the torches. Some of them looked up as I approached, but they didn't say anything. All were inside the pit, which I could now see covered a rough square maybe 30 meters to a side. And then I heard something else, a kind of chittering. To the side I saw creatures, not human, nor like any animal I've ever seen before. They were about a meter tall and walked on 4 chitinous legs with 2 arms in front of them. Their bodies were black and glossy, and their heads had large jaws and mandibles. In science class years ago, we had a few stag beetles in a fish tank, and these creatures reminded me of those. The beetles came towards me. There were 6 of them, and while they were smaller than me, they quickly overpowered me, all the while making horrific clicking and chittering sounds. They took me to the edge of the pit. 2 more beetles standing there pushed a long wooden ramp down into the pit, and the others pushed me down it, and then took the ramp back up. I was stuck, or so it seemed. The walls were too high and smooth to easily climb, and I now noticed several more beetles standing guard at intervals along the wall. Even if I got out, I had no idea where I was or what kind of problem I'd found myself in this time. The humans I was with numbered about 50, quite diverse, but young. There were teenagers and people in their 20s, but no older. At 19, I was pretty much in the middle, age-wise. A woman approached me and started speaking French. Great, at least I could understand her. It's impossible to tell time down in that underground cavern, but I gathered it was about the start of their effective nighttime. The woman, who introduced herself as a Parisian named Josie, explained that the beetles used them for labor and other things, although she refused to elaborate on what other things meant. They kept them fed, but otherwise more or less left them alone. Josie introduced me to the others, showed me to the food, almost exclusively berries and mushrooms, and told me to fill my belly and rest as well as I could, as I would be put to hard work the next day. She was right. The next day I was woken by a human, Carl, shaking me. The beetles had already set up the ramp and were bringing us up in groups of 4. I had no intention of being used as a slave, but decided against taking action until I'd figured things out a bit more. My group was led down a maze of tunnels for about 20 minutes until we arrived at a broader cave. Though much smaller than the main cavern, one of the beetles held a flat piece of slate, on which they had drawn a chalk diagram. They may not be able to speak human languages, but they can hold things with their front limbs and draw. It pointed to each of us in turn, then to a part of the drawing, then to an area of the cave. Jerome, a dark-skinned man from Senegal, explained what I'd already figured out. The beetles wanted us to excavate the cave, according to the plan on the slate. There were some crude pickaxes and other tools already in the cave. I looked at the sharp, heavy tools and looked at the two small beetles. Jerome mouthed no at me. I learned later that people have tried that before, and they always ended up dead. The creatures were stronger than they looked. So I got to work pickaxing and chiseling out a room for the insects. After maybe an hour, the beetles left. Sandy, a Canadian girl of 15, told me that while we could speak freely, the tunnels were maze-like. She had run once, but if there was anywhere to go, she hadn't found it. The beetles had left a few torches for us to work by, but they had much better night vision than we did, and while we would get lost in the tunnels, they could seemingly make their way just fine in complete darkness. I think insects lay trails using pheromones as well, so they don't even need to see in the tunnels. And so it continued for a long time. I carved out cave rooms, made what I believe was insect furniture. I still don't know where they got the wood, and even worked a forge. We marked our days by our rest periods. And long ago, somebody had started scratching lines into the wall of the pit to mark each day. As had become tradition, I scratched my name above the day I arrived. This was day 11,408 since the calendar had started. 31 years earlier, we spent our evenings telling stories, true stories of our lives outside, stories we could remember reading, and stories we made up ourselves during the long working days. I suggested singing once, but was shot down immediately. Apparently the Beatles really didn't like human song. Just like living on the streets. People come and go. Haruki, a Japanese man of 25, was crushed by a falling rock in an excavation. I wasn't in the same group, but I heard the screams echoing through the corridors. We scratched his name below the line for that day. Arrivals are marked above, and departures, as we euphemistically called deaths, below the timeline. Jason appeared after a few months, followed shortly by Louise, in much the same way as I had. And then Caroline, a 16-year-old girl from Mexico, lost it when we were being corralled into the pit at the end of the day. Everybody can snap if they're pushed too far. And as she reached the ramp, Caroline screamed and shouted, then ran into the darkness. Some of the insects followed her, and this was when I learned how fast they can move. They caught up with Caroline after only a few seconds and dragged her to the edge of the pit, pinning her down until the rest of us were all in there and they had pulled up the ramp. More beetles had arrived, and then, in full view of us all, they ripped her apart. Her flesh tore as mandibles slashed into her body. I watched, incapable of help but unable to look away, as she screamed in agony until her windpipe was severed. And then they started to eat her. It took about 10 minutes, in all, and at the end of it there was nothing left. No sign that anything had happened, except for the blood that trickled down the wall of the pit. We saw and heard it all, the rending of flesh, the crunching of bone, the chittering of the insects in what I can only interpret as excitement. When they were finished, the beetles stood on the wall, looked down at us, and walked away like nothing had happened. We were in shock. Of course, there were no stories told that evening. In fact, nobody spoke as Carl scratched Caroline below the mark for that day. We went to sleep in silence, though I don't know if any of us actually slept that night. I certainly didn't. The next day continued as normal. We worked in subdued silence. We returned to the pit. We ate our meager meal of berries and fungi. I was the first to speak. My life down there wasn't great, but it was something I could get on with, something in which I could find a certain level of contentment, not any longer. So for the first time, I asked about the doors. Most of my fellows hadn't properly realized that doors were the trigger. It seemed I was the only one who had traveled anywhere else. The underground realm was the first and only trip any of the others had made. Simon, a fellow Englishman, told us that he had once taken some items to the creatures' homes. They lived in carved caves, presumably mined out by previous generations of human captives. And while he didn't understand their culture, they clearly had decorations. While there, he saw a large slate with a chalk face drawn on it, a human face, one that he didn't recognize until Jenny had arrived a few days later. He hadn't mentioned this at the time, but it helped me start to put the pieces together. I don't understand my curse, but I believe the creatures marked me. The other humans in that place hadn't traveled around like I did. Their first trip through a door took them to the underground. I think the woman in the coffee shop recognized that I was marked and tried to help. I think when she touched me, she disrupted the curse, randomizing my destination. And I thought back to the time I tried to help Anissa, back in the Kenyan farmhouse, and the look on her face as I portaled away. I wonder what she had seen as I disappeared. This was interesting, but it didn't really help us. Then I talked about my travels, how any door, or even window, acted as a portal, how I had created my own, and it didn't work until I'd put a door into the doorway, and gradually, we formed a plan. Most of the floor of the pit was made of smooth stone, but there was a small area of earth, a couple of meters wide. Our captors rarely came down into the pit. They threw food down from above. We carried waste out in buckets, and they didn't need to come down to bring us up, as they would simply withhold food if we refused, as Jerome recalled from years earlier. It was a simple plan, but a slow one. Over the next few months we smuggled tiny bits of stone, wood, and whatever else we could hide on our person. First we built a wooden board, just small enough to cover the soil. One person would dig out soil from below the board, while the rest of us kept watch. The beetles have small eyes, and although their night vision is excellent, they can see very well at a distance, relying more on smell. So if we were careful, we could work without being noticed. And we were careful. If we were caught at any stage of the plan, it would be game over. We worked for less than an hour each night, covering the hole with the board and hiding the board with soil. Extracted earth went, little by little, into our waste buckets. After some time we hit solid rock, but the hole was now about 1.5 meters deep. It was enough. Phase 2 of the plan was riskier. Carving into the solid sections of the wood with sharp rocks made a sound a lot like the beetles' speech, and we knew they had good hearing. We only dared do a tiny bit each night, but eventually we had a frame and a door. All we needed now was a hinge. Slowly we scraped out 3 holes along one side of the door and tied it to the frame with some braided roots we had gathered from the caves. It was done. I doubted it would hold together for long, but it didn't need to. We held a quiet celebration, as much as we could down there, and Louise carved a final message at the end of the timeline. Fuck you. Sandy volunteered to be the first to test it. For all 50 of us to make it, we would need to move fast. And this is why we had decided to use a trapdoor. It would be quicker to jump down, one after another, than to wriggle horizontally through a doorway that size. We checked the surroundings and, seeing only a couple of beetles not paying much attention to us, we decided on our order. I was number 14. Sandy carefully uncovered the trapdoor, opened it, jumped down, and disappeared. It worked, trying to contain our excitement. We followed through in our agreed order. As number 11 jumped in, I heard chittering from above. They had noticed something, but we could do nothing about that. We kept filing in, until I jumped down. This is when I arrived in Western Africa, where I've lived for the last 7 years, and where I hope to live for the rest of my natural life. 13 others had entered the portal before me, but they were nowhere to be seen. I hope that they are living safely elsewhere, away from the clutches of those monstrous slavers. I pray every night that those behind me in the line got away before the creatures reached them. But I haven't heard from them. I'm not sure how I could, unless one of you is reading this. I still don't know how that woman in the coffee shop knew about me. Perhaps she herself had been there, in that cave or another one, and escaped. It would make sense, given the state of her clothes. Or maybe she's something else, a psychic perhaps. She could walk through doors, and maybe I can now, too. Maybe when I left the underground realm, the curse was broken, but I don't dare risk it. Maybe one day I'll see somebody else who is marked, and recognize them. I could hardly warn them of the danger. Nobody would believe me, but I can touch their skin and disrupt the curse. I've escaped, but the insect things are still there, and who knows how many other colonies they have. It's hard to get exact figures, but in the USA alone, 6,000 people a year go missing and are never found. How many of them are trapped, underground, enslaved by a species that regards humans as nothing more than a source of labor and food? 8 years ago, I arrived in West Africa, Not out of choice. You understand, but out of necessity. If you haven't read my earlier notes, you won't understand. This is where I landed after I escaped the underground beetle camp, and where I've lived for so long. Last year I posted my story online. I just meant to put down my thoughts, to ensure my experiences didn't die with me. But I was blown away by the overwhelmingly positive messages in response. The kindness of strangers really is incredible. I suppose I'd resigned myself to my life as it was, a man out of my own country, cut off from family, forced to live on the streets forever. But people gave me hope. It took a bit of work, but I tracked down my family. My father died about 5 years ago, but my mother and sister came to visit me. They stayed a couple of weeks. It was difficult at times. My mother is convinced I had a mental break, and that my story is a delusion, and we both hated when she had to return to England and leave me there. My sister, on the other hand, was more receptive. Hannah's 3 years older than me, and was a proper older sister to me. She annoyed the crap out of me when I was at school, but over the years I really missed her. I video call my mum whenever I can, about once a week, but me and Hannah WhatsApp each other every day. They're planning to visit me again this summer. Hannah is a logistics manager these days. I can't say I'm entirely sure what that means, but she's one of the most organized people I've ever met. A couple of months after they went back, she invited me to a group chat. She'd found others who had escaped those caverns with me. Over the following weeks, more joined, until the group chat had 19 people, plus Hannah. They truly are amazing people, and our experience fighting the beetles had brought out the best in them. All of us are homeless now. Of course, most in a foreign country, and that brings great risks. But 19 of us had survived. None of us had turned to drugs, and all have stories worth hearing. Chao, a Chinese man living in Mexico, now ran his own landscape gardening business. Anupama, or just Anu, an Indian woman now in France, has built a homeless charity and is known for choosing to live on the streets with those she helps. Jerome, the Senegalese man, is a celebrated artist on the streets of Moscow. Each of us is fluent in 2 or more languages, and at least passable in English. We all remember the number we assigned ourselves, the order in which we escaped from the cavern. The last of us to escape was Rajinder, an Indian man who I remembered as a boy of 16. He had been number 26, and had watched as several beetles jumped down into our pen and scuttled towards the remaining humans. Our friends, Josie, number 24, escaped just as the beetles reached them. Evander should have been the 25th of us to escape, but instead he was impaled by the sharp leg of one of the beetles and fell to the ground. Others near Raj were injured. Raj himself was slashed across the arm by the serrated edge of a beetle forearm, surrounded by shiny black death now. He threw himself headfirst into the door, injuring his head as he arrived in the Vietnamese countryside. He doesn't think anybody else escaped after him. 25 of us got out of the caverns. We don't know what happened to the other 6. They could be dead, or perhaps Hannah just hasn't found them yet. We all arrived on land, but who knows where the others came out. If they found themselves in Antarctica, say, or Death Valley, they would have had little chance. I don't think we'll ever find out for sure. So here we were, our group of 19. A few of us have studied insects over the years. No, Nida told me. It's entomology. Etymology is the study of words, or geology, to try to make sense of our imprisonment. Some have tried to forget their time below ground, but none of us ever really could. And as we talked, our discussions adapted and evolved. Hannah set up a Discord server called Beetle Survivors Social Group, but that wasn't enough for her. She sent smartphones to those who didn't already have them. I have no idea how she got smartphones capable of accessing Discord to our members in China and Russia. She sent cash as needed and tracked down most of our families, arranging calls and even visits. And one day, Hannah renamed the server Beetle Survivors Support Group. We talked about our experiences. I posted my story on there, and others wrote up their own. Nida wrote about her research into beetles, and how the creatures we encountered must have different biology than the insects known to science. Jerome sketched the beetles excellently and worked with the biologists to figure out how their bodies probably worked. Jason, Angelique, and I drew maps of the caverns as best we could from memory. Some of us wanted to move on from our experiences, but had spent the last 8 years unable to. We all still had nightmares from time to time. Some of us felt frustrated, unable to do anything about the underground insects, and some of us were angry. People began posting fantasies about fighting and killing the beetles. How we could do it, how many we could take down, how we would celebrate over their chitinous corpses. Soon enough, somebody, I think it was Chow, renamed the server again. Beetle Survivors Revenge Group. Fantasy turned into conjecture, which became plans. Frustration became hope, and anger evolved into determination. I'm still amazed that all of us decided to go through with it. We talked about the problems and hazards. We planned our equipment lists. We worked through our ideas, picking holes in and improving each other's suggestions. But in the hundreds of hours of planning, I never once heard the words, "It's too dangerous." We were as one, a crack unit of commandos, ready to wage war. The date we chose was the 3rd of March, for no particular reason other than we were ready. At exactly 2 p.m. Ghana time, that's where I lived, all 19 of us walked through a door. It was dark. It would take some time for my eyes to adjust from the bright West African sun. I couldn't see anything at first, but then there were a couple of clicks, and flashlights blazed into life near me. We came together and took stock of our situation. There were only 4 of us in the cavern. Febe, a Russian woman, Beshadu, an Ethiopian woman, and Carl, the American who had woken me on my first morning underground. Phoebe and Carl turned off their flashlights and we looked around, listening carefully. There didn't seem to be any beetles near us, presumably because they hadn't been expecting arrivals. We quietly moved together, looking for the wall of the cave. The caverns were once natural, but they have been worked by human hands over many years, being expanded and smoothed over. This worked to our advantage as we traversed the largely stone-free floor and eventually found the relatively flat cave wall. We worked our way along it, still mostly by touch rather than sight, and soon came across an opening, a corridor. A short way down the corridor, we found another opening, coming to a small, empty room. We settled down and went through our equipment. Fabe turned her torch on. We needed to see, but this made us very uncomfortable. How I would have loved to be able to close the door to prevent the light leaking out into the corridor, but the beetles don't have doors, and even if they had, we wouldn't have been able to use them. Besha and Carl had brought several USB battery packs. We'd each fully charged our phones before stepping through the doors, but we had no idea how long we would be down there. We turned off all our phones except for Carl's, which he set to power-saving mode. We all had battery-powered flashlights, and Fabi had a lot of spare batteries. They should last a while. Carl was in the army when he was kidnapped, and had explained to all of us what sort of food we should bring, so we all had a couple of weeks of high-calorie food in our backpacks. We also had weapons. Besha was a markswoman and had a hunting rifle and a pistol with a lot of ammunition. Carl had been working in a quarry and had brought his powerful granite-breaking pick. Fabi had somehow managed to acquire a couple of fire axes, and well, as an occasional gardener, I'd managed to pick up 2 machetes and 4 billhooks. Not everybody has heard of billhooks. They're used to cut down small trees and undergrowth, and those I had sported a 10-inch serrated blade, viciously curved at the end. I figured they would be excellent for severing the limbs of the beetles, and I had a decent amount of experience with them, although only against saplings that didn't fight back. There were 19 of us who entered a door a few minutes earlier. Phoebe, Carl, Besha and I had arrived down here very close together at the same time, but there was no sign of the others. Our group had a variety of personalities and reasons for coming here. Some were angry, some wanted revenge, some were driven by a desire to make the world safer, but I knew everybody well, and I don't believe anyone bottled it. Certainly not 15 of us. Perhaps we might find the others elsewhere in the cave. But for now, we had to assume that we were the only ones who made it. Fortunately, all of our equipment came with us, though it was a shame we didn't have Jew's flamethrower. We had hoped to have enough armed humans for a proper assault. Now we had to change our strategy. Carl was the best of us to plan. He had been on active duty and experienced combat in a small group. The most important thing right now, he said, was for us to get the lay of the land. We weren't sure exactly where we were, and our maps were incomplete. So the first thing was to orient ourselves in the cave system and find out where the beetles were. Phoebe, the smallest of us and light on her feet, offered to scout around and report back. But Carl insisted on going with her. We must never, he said, go out alone. So Besha and I sat in the small room in whispered conversation, our hands never far from our weapons, while Phoebe and Carl crept away.
I thought back to Besha's bit in English when we lived together in the darkness.
And marvelled at her near fluency in her newly acquired Australian accent. It must have been more than 2 hours when we heard movement nearby. I barely heard Besha stand up, although the quiet click when she cocked her pistol sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the caves. As I reached for a machete, Carl's whisper sounded. Don't cock your pistol. Besha, it's double action. You don't need to, and it's too loud. Carl and Phoebe came round the corner. The caves were so dark I don't know if I saw their silhouettes, or only imagined them. The pair sat down. It's not the same cave, said Phoebe. My heart stopped, and my mind raced. Had this all been for nothing? Were we in some random empty underground system, trapped here to die? It's smaller, she continued. At least, the main cavern is. We found a pen, like ours but much smaller. There are burning torches around it, but no humans. It might be their work time, but we haven't seen any so far. Maybe they don't have any slaves right now. There are beetles down here, though, Carl said. We heard some of their clicking, off in the distance. We're not sure how many there are. This corridor has a few small rooms like this, all empty. Probably something they started excavating, but abandoned. Or they had to wait for new slaves. And we're pretty sure we found where they live. We didn't investigate, not with just 2 of us. I have to say, Carl and Phoebe made a great team. They'd been reunited in person only hours ago, but were already finishing each other's sentences. Carl brought out a chemical glow stick. He had many of these, and I was grateful. A flashlight would just have dazzled us at that moment. He and Phoebe sketched out a rough map of what they had explored so far, and we started to plan. We would only get one chance at a surprise attack, so our first strike needed to be precise. Aim too small and we wouldn't do enough to hurt them. Too big, and they would overwhelm us. We only had 2 guns between us. So Besha kept her hunting rifle. She'd become quite a markswoman hunting small game in the Australian outback, and gave the pistol to Carl. Besha and I then walked out to explore for ourselves. The main cavern was left out of our small cave, so we turned right. The single corridor quickly branched off into multiple paths. Besha had brought several balls of string, so we tied one end to an outcropping to help lead us back. It was a risk, but then so was coming here in the first place, and we were reasonably sure by now that this region was abandoned, at least temporarily. We both had several of Carl's chemical glow sticks, and used one to light our way, hiding it whenever we heard the slightest sound. We didn't even try to map that maze-like area of small corridors and dead ends. Besha and I held hands whenever space allowed, and held the other's backpack when it didn't. Her hearing is far more sensitive than mine, so if she suddenly dropped my hand, I knew it was to grip her rifle. And that was my cue to unclip a billhook and machete from my belt. We moved extremely slowly, creeping silently along the left wall, pausing to listen every few meters. We can't have gone more than a few hundred meters when, an hour later, I saw something in front of us. I let go of Besha's hand, put the glow stick away, and brought up a machete and a billhook. Besha saw it as well, and raised her rifle. There were 2 of us. Against these creatures we'd watched massacre our friend years earlier. A rifle and a couple of knives. I hate to admit it, but when it came to fight, flight or freeze, I froze. I don't know what went on in Besha's head at that moment, but for me, it was abject terror. I would simply have been useless in a fight. There was a light, very faint, and flickering, but getting brighter. The 2 of us stood there frozen, anticipating a confrontation. A moment later we heard footsteps, clear as anything in the otherwise absolute silence. They were human footsteps, and underneath those, the occasional faint clicking of a beetle. As the light got closer, We could see the scene clearly. The tunnel widened until about 30 meters in front of us. It came to an end as another tunnel crossed it. 3 humans, very thin and in ragged clothes, walked past, followed by 2 beetles. We watched as they passed in front of us, and then the torchlight and the sounds slowly faded. We stood in absolute silence for what must have been half an hour. Besha was the first to speak. She put her hand to my head, bringing my ear to her mouth, and in the quietest whisper ever made by a human, made her proposal. It's sleep time. Carl and Phoebe said the beetles live on the other side of the main cavern. We should explore. I nodded my agreement, then, realizing that she couldn't see me, whispered okay into her ear. Our progress was even slower and more careful now. At the junction, we tied the string off, not wanting to leave any trace on the path they'd taken, and headed in the direction they'd come from. There was a faint light up ahead, but no sound at all, and gradually we were able to make out the shape of the corridor. Eventually, we came to a split in the corridor. The light was coming from the left branch, so that's where we went, and soon we arrived in a large room. I'd worked the forge occasionally back in our first cavern system, so although it was different, I recognized it immediately. The light was coming from the embers of a stone kiln, which would die completely in the next few hours. We looked around the place, deserted at this time, as expected. There were a few tools that could be used as weapons, but nothing as useful as our own, and not that many. The beetles weren't keen to supply their slaves with anything more powerful than necessary. A chimney led to a small hole in the ceiling. It surely led outside, but it was no more than 20 centimeters wide, far too narrow for any of us to squeeze through. Nearby there was a thick, flat iron plate, which I assumed to be an anvil. Though different from the one I'd used, a hammer lay on top of it. The room was fairly large, but apart from some firewood and lumps of rock, presumably iron ore, it was otherwise empty. We'd seen enough, and headed back out to take the other path. This path led quite quickly to another large cavern, but without any light. After listening for several minutes, I brought out my glow stick, but it had expired. Besha reached into her pack and retrieved her flashlight. This room was a mine, and much bigger than the forge. Several pickaxes were stowed at the far side of the room. Again, it was empty of living creatures. We both knew how it would work. The beetles usher the slaves in, who then move far enough away before taking their pickaxes and starting work. The mine consisted of a main room and smaller corridors, gradually hacked away until the place had become a bit of a warren. We recalled the maze we had been careful not to get lost in earlier. Perhaps that was an earlier mine, abandoned after the iron ore the beetles had been so keen to get had been mined out. As a teenage boy, I'd been wiry and very capable of squeezing into small places, so I volunteered to explore the tunnels, while Besha stayed outside with the flashlight to guide me back. Some of the excavations were plenty big enough for a couple of miners to work side by side. Some, presumably natural tunnels, were barely big enough for me to traverse. A few times the flashlight went out. This was Besha's signal to me that she'd heard something, and I froze in absolute silence until the light came back on, when she was sure it wasn't an unwelcome interruption. Eventually I came back out, grabbed a notepad and pencil, and sketched a map of the tunnels. Then Besha turned her flashlight off and we set off back through the darkness. Before we headed back, we wanted to check one last thing out. Where had the humans and beetles who passed us gone? We were fairly sure, but wanted to be certain. We carefully followed the path they'd taken, and after some time, came out into the main cavern. Off in the distance, we could make out torches around the human pen, and a few shadows of beetles moving around. We had no desire to go in unprepared, so we headed back to the junction. The string guided us home, and, exhausted, we were reunited with Fabe and Carl. We compared our maps. We were fairly sure we had a pretty comprehensive map of most of the complex, with the notable exceptions of the maze Besha and I had found, and the presumed living quarters Fabi and Carl had located but not entered. We started to make a plan. Fabi was the most vicious of us, eager to just start hacking limbs off the beetles, but she gave way to Carl's expertise in warfare. I pointed out that we had never actually fought a beetle, and it would be good to strike small at first. Eventually we came up with the first part of a plan, ate a good amount of food to keep ourselves strong, and went to sleep. We spent the next day waiting. Our timing was off, and the slaves would have been at work already by the time we woke up. Phoebe had actually brought a pack of cards, and by the light of a single flashlight, we each taught each other various games. We slept again, awoke in plenty of time, and the four of us made our way to the mine. It was empty, as we expected, and we each hid ourselves from view in the larger mined-out tunnels. An hour, maybe two, in utter silence and darkness. Then we saw the flicker of an orange torchlight. I steeled myself, reminding myself that we had four of us. I'd put on a big show of bravery, but honestly, if there weren't two people with guns, I don't know if I'd have been any use at all. Besha, Carl and Phoebe were completely hidden. Only I had a view of the entrance. 5 humans entered, followed by 3 beetles. Besha and I had hoped for just 2 beetles.
Like we'd seen leaving the last time.
But this was our best chance. I waited for the humans to cross the main cave to their picks, then shouted, "Now!" The 4 of us turned on flashlights on the floor and leapt into action. Phoebe and I moved to the sides and held back, while Besha fired her hunting rifle. She was an excellent shot, striking one right in the mouth. That would have taken down a human instantly, but the beetles were tough, and it screamed and lunged forward. Or at least, I assume the high-pitched screeching was the beetle equivalent of a scream. Carl unloaded all 8 shots of the pistol into the injured beetle's head. The crack of chitin splitting apart rang across the cavern, and the insect collapsed to the ground, just centimeters from me. 1 down, 2 left. I had a billhook in each hand. A beetle was right in my face. I'd forgotten just how fast they can move, and plunged its front claw at my chest. I leapt back just in time and swung my right billhook at its extended claw. I connected, and using the hook to keep its claw out of the way, stepped sideways to attack its nearest leg with my left billhook. I hooked and pulled with all my strength. The leg popped out, clattering across the floor. Black stuff oozed out of its abdomen. It swung its other front claw at me, but it was unbalanced now. I parried with my left billhook and released it from my right, using it to strike its mandibles from above. One was severed instantly. The thing collapsed to the ground, but it was still moving, still dangerous. I moved to the side, out of the way of its front limbs, and pushed both blades into its head. It stopped moving. I looked around. Carl's granite-breaking pick was lodged deep in the abdomen of the 3rd beetle. As he retrieved the empty pistol from the floor and started reloading, Phoebe, on the other hand, was hacking away at the motionless insect's head with a fire axe, while she shouted a mixture of Russian and Chechen swear words, with occasional English interjections. "Ha! How you like that? Svoloch." Her back was to the cave entrance. Besha was the first to spot it. "Phoebe."
"Behind you!"
Phoebe started to turn. Too late. Blood showered my face. Carl unloaded his pistol. Both Phoebe and the beetle that had attacked her fell to the ground, revealing another beetle behind them. Click.
Blam!
Besha's rifle hit home, and pieces of chitin exploded around us. The beetle, wounded but not down, turned and ran. It could not be allowed to fetch reinforcements. Click.
Blam!
It stumbled, but continued to limp on. Carl grabbed a billhook from me and chased it down. The speed from his adrenaline was more than enough to catch the slowed beetle. Knowing that he had it, I turned my attention to Phoebe. Phoebe was covered in blood, conscious but looking terribly pale. A front beetle limb pierced her side. Having gone all the way through, I hacked it off at the beast's thorax, but I knew I could not pull it out. The serrated edge would have ripped her apart if I drew it back, and if I pulled forward, it would just widen the wound. Carl returned and retrieved his medical kit. As he started to treat Phoebe's injuries, I braced myself for his remonstrations against her for turning her back, for shouting, for losing her attention and focus when she needed it most. I did not expect what came out of his mouth. "You did well, girl." That's when I knew. I think. Phoebe tried to sit up. "No, don't move. I've got this." Phoebe sputtered. and blood dribbled from her mouth. Is it gonna be okay? I kill it? You were amazing, Fabe. You killed it. Now relax. I'll sort you out in no time. Thunth, you. Those were Fabe's last words. She slumped to the ground. Carl laid her down and closed her eyes. Besha, her voice quavering, was the first to speak. Now what? I turned to Carl, expecting him to say something, but was surprised to hear the words come out of my own mouth, seething with a fury I never knew I was capable of. Now, I said slowly and deliberately, now we kill every last motherfucking one of them. Damn right. It was a voice I didn't recognize. In the intensity of the combat, we'd all completely forgotten about the 5 miners towards the back of the cave. 3 women and 2 men, none of them out of their teens, stared on in shock. They were too surprised to join in the fight, but they all desperately wanted out of there. And though they were weak, we knew as we traded our knowledge and experience that they would fight to the very last. There was no chance we could persuade them to let us take the fight to the beetles alone. We stood and sat in the burning orange of the torches and the brilliant white of the flashlights, always watching the cave entrance. As we talked, there were 8 slaves down here, a much smaller group than ours had been. None of them had been down here for more than a few months. And it was then that Besha realized that these beetles were smaller, not by much, but it was noticeable. This beetle colony must be younger than ours. The miners figured there were only about 30 beetles, closer to 25, now that we'd killed these ones. Rosa, a 16-year-old German girl, was somehow able to distinguish between them, although they all looked the same to me. She had even given them names like Dark Claw, Shiny Top, and Bent Tooth, with paper for the first time in the 4 months she'd been in the darkness. She wrote them all down and crossed 5 names off. There were 24 remaining. Of course, we couldn't know how many there might be which she hadn't seen. I asked where the other 3 slaves would be. Martin, a Slovakian boy, said they hadn't seen where they went, but it would probably be the forge, guarded by the 2 beetles who had come in last. So Besha and I headed to the forge and found the 3, still working, and brought them back. The last 2 beetles we had fought had come from the forge when they heard us fighting, and we didn't encounter any more on the way. 11 humans, led by the 3 of us who were more experienced and not weakened by the conditions of slavery. Our 8 new recruits chose their preferred weapons from among the picks and hammers and my spare billhooks. Had a little to eat and drink, not too much, said Carl. Your body's not used to it. And then we walked silently along the long, wide tunnel to the main cavern. If we were quick, the others may not yet have realized anything was amiss. In the dim light of the slave pit's distant torches, we could see 4 or 5 beetles wandering about, doing whatever it is that beetle slavers do when there aren't any slaves around to torment. We huddled around to whisper our tactics, always wary of the beetles' excellent hearing, and as we discussed our options, their advantages and pitfalls. Boss, a boy from Jordan, said simply, "What about the gallery?" Besha, Carl, and I looked at him in astonishment, though we couldn't read each other's expressions. "What gallery?" whispered Carl. Boaz pointed up. "The gallery, above the entrance to their home. You could pick them off from there with the guns." I looked and could just make it out. About 10 meters up, something like a balcony ran along a quarter of the cavern wall on the opposite side to us. If such a thing existed in our old home, none of us had noticed it. A few minutes later, we had a new plan. We would sneak around the edge of the cavern, enter the insect's home, and try to stealthily make our way up to the gallery, as Boaz called it. Carl, having traveled to the entrance 2 days earlier, led the way, in absolute silence, trying not to breathe or even emit any smells, and occasionally freezing if a beetle looked like it might get too close. It took us maybe half an hour to travel 100 meters. We only noticed the beetles when they chittered or moved in front of a torch, and we weren't doing any of that. The entrance, a tall, wide, rectangular hole in the cavern wall, was as much in darkness as anywhere else. Somehow we got there without being spotted. Carl felt his way along the wall and led us into a room on the left. We filed in silently, and Carl brought out one of his weaker glow sticks. We were in, as far as we could tell, a tool storage room, a cube hollowed out from the rock, barely big enough for us all to fit in there. Wooden tables, seemingly of human craftsmanship, lined the walls, and on these tables were all manner of strange tools. I could hardly guess at the function of most of them, and some of them I didn't even know how a beetle could manipulate them. I didn't care. The room had just one entrance. As long as no beetle needed a tool, we would be safe here while a small group scouted the rest of the complex. This time it was Carl and I who moved silently through the caves by the dim light of a glow stick, while Besha stayed with the others. There were a couple more rooms storing various equipment. In one, we found obviously human artifacts, such as watches, credit cards, and mobile phones. We made a note to lead the survivors through here when we were sure it was safe. A long corridor led past these rooms and to a crossroad. We took the left path first. In the living area, there were occasional patches of some sort of gently glowing moss, barely enough to see by, but it meant that we could usually get away with putting the glow stick away. We soon came to an opening on our right and carefully stepped through. I froze, and I can't speak for Carl, but my heart dropped into my stomach. The faint light of the moss in the room shone green reflections off the glossy armor of maybe a dozen beetles. Carl and I stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, until I felt a gentle tap and then a tug on my shoulder. Very carefully, very slowly, I edged back out of the room, and we made our way back to the crossroad. In furtive whispers, we discussed what we'd seen. The beetles were laying on the ground, on what looked like a bed of dried leaves and undergrowth. I recalled a suggestion by Nida that beetles as large as these would use a tremendous amount of energy while active, and that they may sleep a lot more than humans. Carl proposed that if there were indeed about 30 beetles, it seemed that only half or a third were awake at a time. We decided to leave them alone for now and continue exploring. We crept back down the corridor, past the sleeping area, and came to a small room just before the corridor bent around to the left and started to rise. We guessed it would take us to the gallery and decided to check out the room before making our way up. This room had a bit more moss. I could make out Carl's face and the smooth round walls of the cave, which was only about 6 meters across. In the middle was a raised platform, about waist high to a human. For some reason, the thought of a baptismal font came into my mind. We edged slowly towards it. The platform held a rocky bowl, about 40 centimeters wide, filled with water. The water seemed to reflect more light than it had any right to, and as I peered into it, I did not see my reflection. I saw somebody else's face. She was about 20 years old, with pale freckled skin and curly hair. I didn't recognize her. I asked Carl what he saw, and it was the same. Then he pointed to another platform, a small table. On it were a few pieces of chalk and about a dozen slates. The topmost slate held a drawing of the same girl we saw in the bowl. This was it! My heart pounded. This was how they got us. I couldn't fathom how it would work, but they used this bowl, or one like it, to seek us out, mark us, and bring us here. The slates must be part of it. Perhaps they saw many people in the bowl and drew the ones they decided to kidnap. I whispered excitedly. We could destroy the bowl and stop at least this beetle nest from bringing anybody here. Carl disavowed me of that idea. It would be a simple matter for the beetles to just rebuild. Like I'd said just a few hours earlier, we needed to get rid of them, all of them, for now. Then we would continue our exploration. We could always come back. We left the round chamber and continued on. Along and up the tunnel, we were right. The slope led us up into the main cavern. We made sure the gallery was empty, then lay down and peered over the edge, watching from safety. We realized there were only 3 beetles on patrol down there, 29, minus the 5 we had killed and the 3 on patrol. Left 21 unaccounted for, at least half of which we'd found sleeping. A tug from Carl. We were on the rightmost edge of the gallery, so every so slowly, and keeping as low as we could, we hugged the wall and edged along it. As we suspected, there was another corridor leading down from the far end of the gallery. We had crossed over the entrance to the living quarters and were on the other side. We'd been gone quite a while now, and Besha and the others might be getting worried. We agreed to explore this area and head back. Several twists and turns later, the corridor widened and straightened, and I estimated we were back on the same level as our companions. Dimly illuminated in front of us by the occasional patch of glowing moss, we could see 3 openings on either side of the corridor. This time I was the one to touch Carl's shoulder. I'd heard movement. We watched in silence, Carl pointing the pistol, me with billhooks in each hand. 3 doorways down, a shadow, quiet chittering, the faint outline of a shiny black carapace. Moving where? We stood as quiet and motionless as statues. The outline got smaller. A few moments later, the shape rounded a corner and was gone. 10 minutes later, Carl and I dared to breathe again. Carl stayed put while I gingerly pushed forward and moved my head into the nearest doorway. No beetles. I did the same for all 6 entrances, keeping well enough to the side to give Carl a good shot, if he needed it. All were now empty. I returned to Carl and we entered one of the rooms. I'd taken the beetles for Bronze Age creatures, but what I saw blew that notion out of the water. Now granted, my understanding of tech trees is limited to playing Civilization 4 when I was 12, but these guys were well into the Renaissance age, and maybe a lot further. Glass jars and tubes indicated they knew chemistry. Samples of strange powders lay in shallow, curved pots. There was a setup of lenses, which I took to be a form of microscope. We moved on to another room. Here were gears, some sort of half-finished clockwork contraption. I'd seen the beetles grip things, but had no idea they could be so dexterous. I made a mental note to examine a front claw if I got the chance. Another room had something I remembered from back in school, different colored metals, placed in a rectangular box full of liquid, and metal wires coming out of them. The beetles were making electricity. The other rooms had contraptions neither Carl nor I could even guess at. They were clearly scientists, some of them at least. I would have found it difficult to operate their machines with my human hands. Their inventions were obviously designed for beetles, but their purpose eluded us. We didn't stay long, ever wary of the slightest noise. Besides, we'd been gone maybe 2 hours at that point. At the end of the corridor, another passage went left and right. We very carefully peeked around the corner. No beetles, and not too far away on the left. We could just make out the crossroads from earlier. Slowly, silently, we crept back, made a left turn, and returned to the group. I'd been a little worried that they might have got impatient, or assumed us captured or killed, but there they were, some asleep against the walls, some playing cards in the dim light of a blue glow stick. Besha got up and gave me a long hug. "Are you okay? Did you find a way out?" Carl and I woke everybody and drew a map. The storage rooms where we rested, the strange bowl of water, the bizarre science laboratories, the gallery, with entrances at either end, and the room where many of the beetles lay sleeping. We get them. Now, before they wake up. It's near the end of the work day. It was a boy about 18 years old, whose name I hadn't caught yet. "We need a plan," Carl said. "We can't go rushing in." But it was too late. The boy had already stood up and was on the move, as quickly as a person can move without making a sound. Besha turned to Carl and I. "We have to. Hell will be on us in a few minutes, whether we go with him or not." And so all 11 of us grabbed our equipment and stealthed away. Carl put a hand on the boy's shoulder and persuaded him to listen to his plan. If the plan hadn't involved killing the beetles immediately, I doubt the boy would have slowed down. When we got there, it was clear that the beetles had moved. None appeared awake, but I knew that they had shifted around in that room at some point in the last couple of hours. At Carl's direction, we moved silently into the room, shifting around to position ourselves in pairs near a beetle, but we weren't all in position yet. A chittering came from outside. The beetles started to move, all at once, and were upright in less than a second. I'm not sure what happened next. Everything moved so fast. I swung my billhooks. Muzzle flashes lit up the room and rang in my ears, curses in half a dozen languages. I tripped on the leg of a beetle. It pinned me to the ground. Mandibles snapped centimeters from my face. Helplessness. I was dead. Bang! Bang! The beetle's head exploded. I pushed it off me, got to my feet. Another was next to me. Pincers slashed my arm. Billhooks swinging right and left. Its legs ripped off.
Bang, bang, bang!
A third to my side. A slash to its thorax, and a pickaxe from the dark into its head. The next. Where was the next? I saw nothing.
Bang!
Blinded by muzzle flashes, I could make out nothing else. 3 strong light sticks hit the floor, and 2 flashlights searched the ground. Chitinous limbs lay scattered about. Black fluid oozed like ichor from dozens of wounds. And there, a human arm, a foot, a leg with bone sticking out. Did any get away? Carl made no pretense at stealth now. I don't know. I didn't see. They're not moving. Did we get them all? Slowly we started to calm down, as we saw no motion from the oversized bugs. But to be sure, we went methodically from one to the next, severing the heads of those who still had them. We counted 15 beetles down. We'd had the element of surprise, but it wasn't enough. 4 of the rescued slaves, slower and weaker than Besha, Carl and I, were among the dead, and 2 others lay dying beyond hope. We had all sustained injuries, and I counted myself lucky to have received a mere flesh wound. As an ex-soldier, I don't envy what Carl had to do next. After we made the 2 mortally wounded girls as comfortable as they could be, Carl whispered to them. He never told us what he said, but I saw each in turn nod their heads. Carl then brought up his pistol, and with a single shot to the head each, put them out of their misery. He kneeled down in silence for several minutes. When he stood up, Besha put her hand on him. "Are you—" "Don't." There were 5 of us left. Besha, Carl and myself, plus the German girl Rosa and a Polynesian boy named Salema. We knew we hadn't got all the beetles, and stealth was off the table now. It was me who spoke first. There are 2 directions in the living area we haven't tried. Left at the crossroads, and straight past the workshops. If there's a way out, it must be one of those. Left was closer, so we went that way. I wish we hadn't. The corridor bent ever so slightly, just enough to block our vision until we got there. When we rounded the last corner, we saw what has haunted me every night since. I call it the throne room. She was bigger than I would have imagined possible, at least 8 meters tall. Her body was swollen and her abdomen dripped with mucus. Around the room lay dozens of eggs, as big as my hand, some intact, others broken open, as her enormous compound eyes turned on us. Her mouth opened wide, revealing hundreds of sharp teeth like no beetle I've ever seen. The shriek that came from that mouth cannot be described in words, except to say that it froze my blood. But then, a human voice. "It's got no mandibles." It was true. No mandibles, and no limbs. It was helpless. Besha and Carl opened fire with everything they had. The queen thrashed her body violently and spewed dark liquid in our direction. But it didn't last long. Besha showed off her markswomanship, and Carl demonstrated how quickly he could reload the pistol. The queen gave a final screech and collapsed to the ground, shaking the throne room like an earthquake. Helpless, I thought. I was wrong. Salema had caught the worst of the sticky black substance the queen had sent our way, and was down on the ground, struggling to move. And then we heard it. Hundreds of chittering, clicking insects came from all around the room, and Salema was their first meal. The beetles that swarmed him barely came up to my ankle, but there were too many of them. Salema was dead in seconds, or at least, I hope he was.
"Run!"
said Besha, and none of us argued. There was only one way to go, one corridor we hadn't tried. We made it to the crossroads, and Carl threw an industrial glow stick ahead of us as we turned left. More beetles, adult-sized, were speeding towards us. We ran with every ounce of strength down that corridor. We didn't know if it was our best option, just that it was our only option. As we fled, Carl and Besha turned to take shots at the enemy. We hurtled past the corridor that led to the workshops and into the unknown. Even with the covering fire, the beetles were gaining on us. But after 50 meters, we saw a light up ahead. I grabbed a flashlight from Carl's belt and pointed. The tunnel ended ahead of us, and another tunnel continued, nearly 2 meters above us. A tunnel made of earth and roots. A tunnel through which shone daylight. With an almost inhuman burst of speed, Rosa leapt and scrambled up the wall and into the earthen tunnel. "Go!"
Besha!
I cried, putting my hands down to push her feet up. Besha climbed up and grabbed a root. The root gave way, and the pressure as she fell back on my hands was almost too much for me to bear. But I wasn't letting go so easily. I pushed with all my might, and she scrambled to safety. Besha turned back and leveled her rifle at me.
Blam! Blam!
A beetle, now dead, hurtled into my back and knocked me to the ground. Besha reached her hand down, and I grabbed it. Carl was shooting fast enough that the beetles were advancing slowly, waiting for an opportunity. With Besha's help, I scrambled up and looked back. Carl shot again. Click. "Billhooks!" shouted Carl. I threw both of mine down to him. He caught one, while the other clattered to the ground.
Run!
We ran. Carl was surrounded. There were at least 4, maybe more, of those beasts around him. He had no chance, but he didn't try to escape. I hope he took a lot of them down with him. I know that none of them followed us into daylight. We tried to help Rosa, but she wanted nothing to do with us anymore. I can't say I blame her. After we stopped running, miles from the caves, she left us with barely a word. I don't know where she went. We emerged. We found out later, in the forests of Romania. Besha and I are an item now, and Hannah is arranging for a house to be built for us with no doors or windows. We've talked about kids, but we have no idea if the curse would pass to them. 19 of us entered doors that day. 4 of us arrived in the same cavern, but months later, we haven't heard from any of the rest. We thought there was just one system. We know better now. These things could be everywhere. With luck, killing the queen is enough to shut down that particular nest. But there are only 3 of us with the curse, and Rosa hasn't joined our Discord group. Carl and Phoebe are dead. 15 others are unaccounted for. If anybody takes the fight to the beetles again, it will have to be a new generation. Besha and I are retired. We just hope that our story here might be of use to our future comrades in arms. Story 2. Hal's low-cost thrift and consignment. The worst part about insomnia is the boredom. Nothing open except for the seedy places. Nobody awake except for the seedy people. Nothing to do except watch movies and eat sunflower seeds. Seriously, fuck insomnia. My sleep capacity generally comes and goes in waves, but the few weeks before Hal's were especially rough. There was no inciting incident, just that general feeling of restlessness and anxiety that has become a familiar friend over the years. I tried all of the standard assists: warm milk, old movies, cut down on my caffeine intake, all the usual things that people recommend but never work. Eventually, more out of boredom than anything else, I took to taking late-night walks through the city. I worked a shitty job as a projectionist at a local movie theater, and on the weekends I didn't often get off work until the last movie finished, and the city had long since wound down by the time I was free. The first week or 2 I stayed towards the well-lit areas populated by the intoxicated, both rich and poor, but while the people watching was always good, I quickly grew tired of the relentless noise and began wandering off the beaten path. I'm not sure how I'd never noticed Hal's before. I distinctly remembered buying smokes at the dilapidated gas station across the street on several occasions, and I'm sure my eyes would have been drawn to the large storefront windows still brightly lit and welcoming at 3 a.m. The neon sign pronouncing it Hal's low-cost thrift and consignment glowed in garishly conflicting colors, except for the first S, which was burnt out. Of course I would come to realize that there were very good reasons I had never seen it before, but that first night I wondered if maybe I was hallucinating from sleep deprivation. I entered, of course, even if I didn't feel the need to validate that the whole thing wasn't just a figment of my imagination. There was no way I was denying my curiosity. It was probably the smell that I noticed first, kind of a combination of burning sage and rancid meat, but in a weirdly good kind of way. Best thing I can compare it to is a beach bonfire at low tide. The place was packed full of merchandise, all displayed very neatly on row after row of shelving, but without any sign of clear organization. Knickknacks sat on the same shelves as old magazines and jumper cables. A bizarre collection of artwork decorated the walls, from shadow boxes holding sports paraphernalia to Pink Floyd posters to copies of famous Impressionist paintings. The wall furthest from the front entrance was actually just an unbroken line of doors. Each door was crafted in an entirely different style, and each painted a different color to create a full-length pride flag along the wall. In the center, the green door actually appeared to be an elevator, which really just raised additional questions. I began to browse the first aisle to the left of the front door. A full silver-plated dining set, a clown costume, a chainsaw without a chain, 4 cookbooks, a Super Soaker XP100 already filled with water, several fake antique-looking religious relics, such as crosses and Buddha heads, and a full-length evening cloak that made me immediately start contemplating a career as a supervillain, if for no other reason than I would look amazing in it. I browsed several more aisles with a bemused smile on my face, as the truly eclectic inventory continued to defy any clear organizational sense, until a gruff voice cleared its throat. I glanced up to see the shopkeeper behind the front counter staring at me. He was a medium-sized man, but held a clear, "don't fuck with me" aura around him. His head was shaved bald, and his arms and shoulders indicated someone who had spent more than a few years working in trades. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice a low grumble that ran the line between professionalism and wanting to throw your ass to the curb. I shot him one of my patented disarming smiles. "Not really. I'm just browsing." He continued to stare for a moment, his eyes probing as if searching for a way to sort me into one of the Jungian archetypes that all retail employees have for their customers. "Incubus?" he asked. Finally. "Excuse me? Are you an incubus?" he responded, his eyes still searching mine. "No, Gemini, actually. Well, on the cusp with Cancer. Really? I didn't think people actually use the astrology pickup in real life. I gotta ask, do you get a lot of success with that one? With nostalgia being all the rage these days, going for one of the classic pickup lines is actually a brilliant idea." The corner of the man's mouth twitched just for a moment before returning to its painted-on scowl. That immediately put me at ease. Couldn't work the late-night shift without having that hard shell of an exterior, but if I could touch a sense of humor, he probably wouldn't be throwing me out anytime soon. "I don't get a lot of people coming in here just to browse," he said, his voice having moved slightly away from the gravelly grumble he was using before. Less Bob Dylan, more Bob's Burgers. Most know exactly what they want by the time they lay eyes on this place. I shrugged. What can I say? I'm an impulsive sort. "Hey, how much is this?" I lifted up a snow globe that held what looked like a large hospital. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. "Good eye, that's $200. I whistled, immediately placing it carefully back on the rack. Pricey for a paperweight. Collector's item. There are a lot of stories inside that little snow globe. You could probably get a couple thousand from the right buyer if you're fine dealing with that kind of person. I take it since you're selling it for $200. You're not fine with that." The corner of the shopkeeper's mouth twitched again. I could tell he was warming to me. "I'm pretty sure you're not here for that old thing anyways." "What am I here for then?" "I'm not sure yet. Keep browsing. I'm sure you'll find it." I did as I was told. An antique set of writing quills, what looked like a defunct Tesla coil, a compass and a sextant, a typewriter, a VCR, a few old board games I had never heard of, and a few other raggedy children's toys, including an actual Raggedy Ann doll. Nothing really struck my fancy until I was flipping through a rack of clothing and came across a treasure. I delightedly snatched it up and approached the front counter. Placing it in front of the shopkeeper, he raised another eyebrow at me, and I beamed a smile at him in return. "I've always wanted one of these," I chortled. The shopkeep shook his head and pressed a few buttons on the archaic register. Not Faye, then. Never met a Faye with a decent sense of humor. For the white t-shirt with "I'm with stupid" written on it. That'll be $1.53. I fished a handful of coins out of my pocket and counted out exact change. He took it and sorted the money into the correct slots. He looked back up at me and shook his head. This has got to be the dumbest sale I've made this year. I'm not even sure why that was on the rack. Hey, I'm not complaining, I said, pulling the new purchase over the shirt I was already wearing. Did you just open? I walk by this area pretty often, and I'm sure I've never seen you here before. The man's smile came out fully into the open. Yes and no. We've been in business for a long time, but I guess you could say we're new to the area. Well, I hope you stick around for a while. Hal, I said, nodding with feigned understanding as I extended my hand. You've got a bunch of weird shit in here, and there aren't many other places for me to go shopping at this time of night. Butch, the shopkeeper replied, shaking my outstretched hand. Excuse me? My name's Butch, not Hal. What the hell would the owner be doing working the front counter at 3 a.m.? I threw my head back and laughed. I stand corrected. Butch grinned. So not an incubus, not a fae, not a vamp. What the hell are you doing in my shop? I raised an eyebrow. Buying vintage clothing, apparently. No, seriously? What's your deal? Shapeshifter? Wendigo? Cannibal? Dude, I've worked enough retail to know all about the normal customer archetypes, but I think you've lost me on these. Is a shapeshifter one of those shoplifters who keeps showing up in different clothes like they're actually fooling anyone? Butch looked at me in perplexity, but a little bell rang announcing the arrival of another customer before he could continue his line of questioning. We both glanced towards the door instinctually, and I suddenly also began wondering what the hell I was doing in this store. The woman who had just entered was tall, disturbingly tall. At least that was my first impression. I soon realized, though, that she wasn't actually tall. She was just floating a solid 2 feet off the ground. She wore a long, pale white and semi-transparent dress that fell clearly past her feet and dragged gently on the floor. A white veil was pinned to her unkempt mane of dark hair and spread across her face. That veil did nothing to disguise the bloodshot and sorrowful eyes, the broken nose, nor the mouth that hung open to the center of her chest, leaving a large black void from her cracked and broken top teeth to well past her neck. I recoiled in horror, slipping and falling directly onto my ass before scooting myself back until my back hit a rack of shelves and a hairy, taxidermied hand fell onto my lap. I held it up in preparation to do battle should I need to. The spectre, however, paid me absolutely no mind. She merely glided down one of the aisles, raised her hand to delicately select something off a shelf, and then floated back up to Butch's counter. Evening, Maeve. Just the usual? Butch asked casually. The woman's cavernous mouth seemed to open wider, and a reverberating moan began to vibrate my soul. It wasn't loud, but it suddenly reminded me of the sound I heard my mother make over my grandfather's deathbed when I was 9 years old. All right, gorgeous. It's 4:50. The woman in white reached out a hand limply and dropped a handful of crumpled bills on the counter. She then turned and slowly glided out of the door. My shaking hands continued to point the furry limb at her long past the point she was out of sight. Throat lozenges, stated Butch. I swept the leg to point at him, my heart still racing and my eyes wide. Butch seemed unconcerned. Maeve comes in every night for a pack. Her work leaves her throat pretty sore. I'm not sure if they do much good, but it's always the regulars who keep a business afloat. That was a fucking banshee, I almost screamed. Butch's eyebrows raised as though impressed. Wow, he said. I'm impressed. Most humans wouldn't recognize one on sight. Hey, could you stop pointing that thing at me? They can get a little unpredictable if you're not used to them. I kept my impromptu weapon trained on him for another moment before allowing my hand, still tightly clenched, to fall into my lap. I continued to breathe shakily for another moment and tried to get my head straight. I'm sorry, I said once I felt like I could speak without screaming. That was really not something I expected to see tonight. What the fuck? Butch, banshees are fucking real? And they come in here every night for pharyngitis treatment? What the fuck is this place? I realized my voice was starting to gain volume again. I stopped, swallowed, and took another raspy breath. "Sorry," I said again. "I've never reacted well when I get really scared. Believe me, I wish that didn't happen to me." But the thing still clasped in my hand suddenly lurched. I curiously glanced down at it, only just then fully noticing what I had been clenching in my fist. This is a monkey's paw, isn't it?" "Yeah, you may want to put that down before you make another wish," said Butch, an amused smile on his face. "Why, what did I say?" "Still scared?" "Of what?" "Oh, right, ugly banshee chick. Nah, I'm good now. Why do my pants smell bad?" Butch rolled his eyes. "Go ahead and grab a new pair. No charge." "Nice. Can I use your bathroom?" He nodded towards the far wall of the shop. "Purple door. I'd avoid opening any others if I were you." "Spoil sport. Is that elevator real?" "Yep. And no, I'm not answering any follow-up questions until I can't smell you anymore." 10 minutes later, I was feeling much cleaner, if slightly chilly, in my newly bought I'm with stupid t-shirt and newly gifted cum-slut booty shorts. I must have been starting to grow on Butch, because other than another twitch of his mouth and slight shake of his head, he didn't much react to my change in style. "So you're actually just straight human, aren't you?" he asked ruefully. "I can't think of another species that would so flagrantly disregard their own self-respect." "Never seen the video of the otter raping a decapitated fish head, have you?" "You know what I mean. Even the blood orgy folk will still show up in something tailored at least." "Butch, you just had a floating girl in here wearing funeral clothes." "Versace. Maeve's taste is old-fashioned, but always quality." I paused with my mouth open before shutting it slowly. "All right then. I guess I stand corrected. Should I change so I don't offend the blood orgy folk?" I finally got a full laugh from Butch. "What's your name?" "Kid?" "Clear." "Sorry?" "Clear. Middle name is Water. My parents were hippies, also big fans of revivals." "Man, thought I drew the short straw when it came to names. But you've got me beat. So what?" The shop bell rang again. Unlike with the previous customer, I felt not even the slightest twinge of fear as the latest monster strolled casually into the building. 6.5 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown fur, the man with the overtly canine face was sporting a cordial grin. The werewolf nodded casually at Butch and began strolling the aisles. Butch nodded back and then raised an eyebrow at me as though interested in my newfound stoicism. "Well?" he asked, as if unsure whether or not I was going to shit myself again. "I can't believe you gave me a hard time about my booty shorts and then didn't blink at that guy dropping werewolf dong." Butch grunted in satisfaction. "Guess that monkey's paw was the real deal. I should bump up the price." "You didn't know?" He shook his head. "It's good policy not to fuck around with a monkey's paw. Had a feeling it was legit. Though, a lot of the other stuff we got from that particular estate ended up being pretty extraordinary." There was a pause. "Such as?" I demanded. "Come on, dude. You can't drop that line and then not show off a bit." Butch laughed again and turned around to the display wall behind the counter. He pulled down a shadow box and laid it on the counter in front of me. Inside was an almost cartoonishly large revolver, 6-chamber, but with a bulbous barrel that could have fired a skee ball. There were 3 huge rounds already loaded, but with no caliber that I recognized. "You seem like the kind of guy who would appreciate this." He opened the case and gestured for me to pick it up. I did, immediately surprised by its apparent weightlessness. I spun it around my finger, gunslinger style, and leveled it harmlessly towards the doors at the end of the hall. The werewolf glanced up at me curiously for a moment before returning to his shopping. "Love the way it handles, but I don't recognize the make. One of a kind," Butch said. "They call it the Chekhov gun." I laughed. "Seriously? Guess I have to fire it then." "Huh?" "Probably. but I wouldn't waste the ammo if you don't have to. Those 3 rounds are all there are left. How very hackneyed, I said, examining one of the rounds. These things seem a bit unnecessary. Unless you're hunting kaiju, what are they? I've just taken to calling them MacGuffins. I've only seen it used once, during a debate over the bathroom being only for paying customers. One thing led to another, and a full army of vampires ended up laying siege to the shop. Had to have been at least 400 or 500 of them. Hal shot off a round from this and it fired an actual sun. Gave me second-degree burns on every exposed inch of skin, but it fried every last one of those fuckers. Wait, it shoots a sun? I asked incredulously, cautiously setting the gun back on the counter. No, it shoots whatever it has to get the job done, Butch explained. That makes no sense whatsoever. You do realize there's a werewolf browsing through old Megadeth CDs 10 feet behind you, right? I turned around and locked eyes with the large, hairy fellow for a moment. His tongue lolled out of the side of his mouth in a wolfish smile, and he winked at me. I mean, I get what you're saying, but I still think there's a big difference between ancient legends and a relatively modern literary construct. Butch opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment the door slammed open with enough force to cause the lights to flicker. I glanced over my shoulder at the darkened doorway, noticing Butch's hand move to rest lightly on the Chekhov gun on the counter. The werewolf's hackles raised as a low growl began to rumble from his direction. The man in the doorway seemed human enough. If high-stakes lawyers could be considered human, that is, he was tall, but not intimidatingly so. His suit was well-tailored, his hair immaculate. The charming smile on his face belied the cold contempt in his eyes. "Hey, Butch," he said, his voice a purring baritone. "Hey, Azzy. Long time no see," Butch replied, his face devoid of emotion. "Way too long." The man pulled a coin from his pocket and began rolling it back and forth across his fingers. "Is your boss around?" "You know I haven't seen Hal in months. Not since that incident with the Purgatory delegation. Paychecks are still rolling in though, so he's out there somewhere. If you find him, let him know I'm taking the fender for a Christmas bonus." Az shook his head in feigned disappointment. "It really would be in your best interest to help me track him down. Butch, you know the deal he made to run this place expired at the end of last month. Now my employer has a lot of respect for the old man and everything he's done over the years, so he's more than willing to renegotiate the terms." Butch shook his head. "You're not hearing me. Az, I don't know where the guy is, and I don't have any way of getting a hold of him." "Come on, you really mean to tell me your boss can't suss out where he is?" I'm starting to get why his little rebellion failed. Still not sure how he duped all you idiots into following his lead. Though, was that like a Trump thing? Az's eyes narrowed. "That's low even for you, Butch." I laughed involuntarily. "I don't know, man, if the MAGA hat fits." Suddenly a force slammed into me, hurling me over the counter and against the wall behind the register. Shock shuddered through my body as a display hook pierced my shoulder. A flood of moisture spread down my back, and I immediately started feeling a little woozy. Also a lot pissed. I jerked my head up to glare at Az. "Motherfucker, I just bought this shirt." I felt myself reverse direction, flying off the wall and across the store. I flailed painfully as I soared, managing to tip over one of the racks before colliding with the werewolf. I couldn't help but marvel at how soft he was as we hit the floor and slid into another rack, bringing its contents down on us. I always envisioned werewolf fur as being more coarse, I thought as I weighted out the falling inventory. "Sorry, Jack," I muttered, rolling away from the werewolf and painfully climbing to my feet. "Cool if I call you Jack. Never caught your actual name." Jack growled, shaking his head like a wet dog. "I don't know why you have to make me hurt your friends before you tell me what I want to know. Butch, you know how much it pains me to hurt innocent bystanders." Butch was levitating over the cash register, his limbs shaking violently as he appeared to reflexively attempt to swallow his own tongue. I started grabbing anything within reach and throwing it at Az. I managed to score a direct hit with a tea kettle and an old computer mouse, but it was the lawn dart directly to the head that finally got his attention. Butch took in a raspy breath and fell to the ground as Az's head spun around to glare at me. His hand shot up and I felt my windpipe close. My hands instinctively went to my neck as I tried desperately to take in air. "Idiot child," rasped Azzy, his eyes appearing a dull red as the edges of my vision began to darken. "Do you have any idea who you're—" I lost the rest of his sentence as Jack launched himself into Az, and the two of them flew into another rack. I fell to my knees, sucking in air and letting the world come back into focus. It sounded like Jack got one or two good swipes in with his vicious-looking claws before he flew backwards again, crashing through one of the doors at the back of the store. What lay beyond remained unknown, as the door immediately reformed behind him, pulling back in its shattered wood until no trace of damage remained. Az's head came bobbing into sight over the racks. I got back to my feet. This whole lack of fear thing was really starting to grow on me. "You can force choke me all you want, Father," I snarled at him. "We both know you're just a whiny little sand-hating bitch." Az's face was filled with fury as he raised his hand to smite me again. Suddenly, Butch stepped between us, the Chekhov gun leveled squarely at Az's head. Az's look turned to one of contempt, but his hand still lowered slightly. "How many of those bullets are you down to, Butch?" he asked. "2? 3? Are you really sure you want to waste one on little old me?" "What?" "Then, will you use on the one he sends after me, or the one after that? Eventually, the big man himself will want to come. Better hope you still have at least one left for him." My eyes fell on another gun that had fallen onto the floor in the struggle, one that I had noticed on my first walkthrough of the aisles. A stupid idea popped into my head. I reached down and grabbed it, cocking it loudly as I leveled it towards Az. "Step aside, Butch," I growled. Butch shot a look back at me, saw what I held, and gave me a tight grin as he lowered the Chekhov gun and stepped out of my way. I squeezed the trigger on the Super Soaker XP100 and sent a stream of water directly into Az's face. His scream was piercing as the smoke immediately started pouring off his melting face. I stepped towards him, continuously pumping more water as I adjusted my stream to any piece of exposed skin his squirming left exposed. "The power of Christ compels you, bitch!" I yelled as I stood over him, furiously pumping the squirt gun. "Don't fuck with retail workers." Flesh fell from the demon's bones like really good barbecue ribs, bubbling into vapor from the floor. His screams became so high-pitched that I heard a few of the more delicate glass items in the shop shatter. I didn't let up on the stream of water until the plastic toy lost pressure and dribbled to a stop. Az collapsed, his clothes falling into a pile on the floor as his body steamed away. I stood panting, feeling the adrenaline burning off my skin. My shoulder, forgotten during the fight, began to throb painfully, and the squirt gun slipped from my grasp. "Did you seriously just use a Pulp Fiction line on me?" I looked up at Butch in surprise. "I mean, how often am I really going to have an opportunity like that?" I just couldn't resist. He chuckled along with me. "How'd you know that Super Soaker would work?" "You made it pretty easy to figure out what he was with all that boss's rebellion talk. And I thought with the kind of shit you have in here, there was a pretty decent chance that thing was filled with holy water. Anyway, if it wasn't, I knew you'd probably just look at me like I was an idiot and shoot him with the Chekhov gun instead. So, you know, what the hell?" He chuckled again and walked over to me to examine my shoulder. "How's it look?" I asked through gritted teeth. "I mean, you're going to need stitches, probably, but I don't think you're going to bleed out anytime soon." I nodded, then glanced over at the back of the shop towards the door Jack had disappeared through. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked. "Jack?" he replied. "Yeah, he'll be fine. He's a pretty solid guy, has friends everywhere. I'm sure someone over there will put him up until he finds his way back." Holy shit, his name really is Jack. I thought I was just being clever. Nobody knows his real name. Actually, He doesn't talk much, but most people end up landing on that joke eventually, so it's kind of just stuck. Ow, my self-esteem. I deadpanned. What's over there? Over where? You said someone over there will put him up. What's over there? Oh, that door leads to the back rooms. It opens up somewhere different every time, so you usually have to find another way back if you go through it. I nodded, not really understanding, but increasingly distracted by the radiating pain in my shoulder. Well, let me know next time you see him. I think I owe that guy a beer. Next question. Where is the nearest hospital? He grinned. Come on, I'll patch you up. Gotten pretty good at it over the years. Working this job. Only lost a couple dozen patients. I nodded and followed as he led to another door behind the cash register. He stopped with his hand on the knob. Oh, and remember how I was trying to figure out why you ended up finding this place? I think I figured it out. Want a job? I looked at him. I thought about the banshee, and the monkey's paw, and the werewolf, and the demon. Then I thought about the long series of dead-end, boring jobs I'd had up until this point. Do you have a dental plan? My third week working at Hal's found me shoveling harpy shit. The filthy birds used their horrifically scarred, twisted, and just generally unattractive human heads to hurl insults at me as the sweat dripped down my face. Cleaning this particular cage was always rough, as the dirty hybrids took a great deal of joy in trying to add to the mess faster than I could clean it. My poop cart was half full of a variety of dung, having already cleaned out the unicorn, chupacabra, thunderbird, and yeti cages. I'm not sure exactly what bizarre combination of chemistry and magic was happening, but somehow the scent emanating from the cart reminded me of quality chicken parmesan. Hey, cocksucker. Liking that smell? Want a taste from the sauce? Screeched Blanche from high above me. The four disgusting creatures laughed raucously and started lobbing down additional work for me to enjoy. Rose fluttered down to stare at me. If you're going to be doing butt stuff with us, you're going to need some lube. And she spat directly at my face. I swung up my pitchfork to block, the spittle immediately sizzling through one of the tines and dripping to the straw-covered floor. Rose, I said sternly, if you ruin my equipment, I'm just going to head back to the thrift shop and you can spend the next week swimming in compost. Rose snorted at me and flapped her way back up the perches where her sisters sat chortling. I slipped back on my headphones to drown out the screeching vitriol and continued with my chores. Internally, I reminded myself that I was still in my training period, which, much like many of my previous jobs, mostly consisted of doing all the work that Butch didn't want to do. Still, though, I thought as I used the remaining part of the pitchfork to lift another load of rancid harpy shit, this was better than working at Denny's. Despite the intrinsically unpleasant nature of the cleanup, I genuinely enjoyed spending time in the menagerie. 10-year-old me had been utterly obsessed with cryptids, so getting the opportunity to crawl into a large pen and cuddle with a couple dozen jackalopes was kind of a dream. Not to mention the weekly poker games with the centaurs. I had doubled my first paycheck when I realized they were incapable of understanding the concept of bluffing. Half an hour later, and I could finally walk across the harpy cage and actually feel the firmness of the floor beneath my feet. Exhaling explosively, I pulled the wheelbarrow out of the cage, locked the door behind me, and leaned tiredly against the bars. I allowed my eyes to wander around the store as I tried to will my muscles into relaxation. Much like the thrift shop, the menagerie seemed to have been organized by an utter madman. Large beasts were housed next to tiny, predators next to prey, those capable of speech across from those who mostly just roared or screeched. The only exception was the largest animals, dragons, mammoths, the bipolar cyclops, etc., who were all held by the far west wall where the ceiling was highest. A soft bell rang as a customer entered. I stabbed the pitchfork into the pile of waste, pulled off my headphones, and began walking towards the front to make myself available. Behind me, Dorothy made a comment on my backside that would have been flattering from anyone else and sent another bomb through the bars to splatter at my feet. I was fully prepared to launch into a formal retail greeting, but my words caught in my throat as I saw who had entered. Dark hair, full lips, green-grey eyes that pierced through every defense I possessed. A low-cut blouse that presented a couple very convincing reasons to break eye contact. This woman's beauty was otherworldly. Actually, considering the nature of most of my clientele, otherworldly was probably more literal than literary. She smiled at me, and I forgot my standard greeting, my name, and how to breathe. "Hey there, new guy," she purred softly. "King illegal forest to pig wild killin' it is," I responded wittily. She blinked. "Well, that one's new." "Excuse me for a moment." I turned and walked over to the barrel full of coconut rum I had prepared to feed the rougarou and dunked my head in, taking in a few large mouthfuls. I re-emerged, dripping, cold, and a little queasy from the taste.
"Let me try that again,"
I said. Nothing like a full immersion in alcohol to help talk to a woman way out of your league. "Hi, welcome to Hal's low-cost menagerie. My name's Clear. How can I help you?" The woman smiled broadly. "I must say, you handled that better than a lot of men. A lot of things get easier once a guy embraces his own idiocy. What brings you in today? Ingredients, food, or companionship?" "I actually just needed to have a word with Butch. Is he around?" "Butch should be covering the counter in the thrift shop. If you wanted to look around for a bit, I can run and grab him for you. Maybe in a minute. It's been a long time since I've been in this part of the shop." She stepped forward and looped her arm with mine. And since this is the section I walked into, I think the shop wants us to get acquainted. Goosebumps raised instantly on the part of her arm that touched mine, which immediately brought up a twinge of nervous suspicion. Butch had insisted that I reverse my monkey paw wish, quite understandably of the opinion that fear was absolutely necessary to keep oneself from doing something idiotically reckless in an environment like Hal's. We worked on the wording of the wish for a ridiculously long time to restore my fear, allow me to function while afraid without crapping my pants, and to avoid any comically ironic twists. It seemed to work out pretty well, although I had noticed that the more scared I became, the more I would impulsively make sardonic comments. Butch didn't seem to notice that part. Since it fit my personality like a glove, I led the distractingly beautiful woman through the dank maze of cages, allowing her to direct the duration spent admiring each of the animals. She had obviously been around the mythical block a few times, since she barely seemed impressed by some of the more commonplace residents like the chimeras and the Jersey Devils. She hurried past the harpy cages as the four of them immediately began to harmonize in a repetitive chant of whore, but she did fall instantly in love with the three-headed quackers. Brushing off my warnings, I had seen a few of the more mature ones let out small belches of fire. She released my arm and climbed directly into the pen with them, laying down and allowing them to curiously climb over her while she laughed delightedly. "Oh, I love these," she exclaimed. "What are they?" "They were just discovered a couple weeks ago. We decided to call them Chalamets." "Chalamets?" "Yeah, because they're cute, but also kind of off-putting." She laughed again as one of them began to shimmy its body down the front of her blouse. I sternly told myself that it was ridiculous to be jealous of a rodent. The woman rose gracefully back to her feet. The Chalamet still nestled comfortably between her breasts. Two of its heads were sticking out of the top of her shirt, looking around gleefully. The third seemed to have fallen asleep against the swell of her cleavage. "Lucky jerk. I guess I've been chosen," she declared, climbing carefully out of the pen. "This little guy's coming home with me." "The pets pick the owners," I agreed. "We can get you checked out in the thrift shop if you still needed to talk to Butch. Ms. Babs." I was incredibly confused for a moment because the voice that spoke her name was not the dulcet music she had used before, but rather masculine and gruff and gravelly. Also, it seemed to be coming from behind me. Butch was standing next to the Kelpie stalls. His customary scowl had descended into a disgusted grimace. Babs gave him a smile that would have lit up a cemetery, but Butch didn't soften so much as a werewolf's hair. "I thought we agreed that it would be best if you stayed away from the shop. Butch said, his voice dangerous. I thought that was more of a suggestion. Babs entreated. I didn't think you had actually trespassed me. That suggestion was based off the assumption that you didn't want to see me any more than I wanted to see you. Butch, come on, don't be like that. It's been, what, 50 years since the last time we saw each other? Think for a minute. Would I stay away that long only to show up now if it wasn't important? Why do you have a Chalamet between your tits? Babs crossed her hands across her chest protectively. Even someone like me needs an emotional support animal. Butch, get a harpy, then you'd have more in common. I knew it was you who got them to call me that. I started laughing uncontrollably. Butch and Babs paused their fighting to stare at me. Butch, you absolute rascal. I chortled. You never told me you used to be married. It's not often that you get to witness an actual miracle, so I made sure to relish every second that I was able to see Butch blush. Babs suddenly became very occupied scratching a basilisk behind its ear. My shit-eating grin stayed on my face as I forced a big hug on Butch. Man, she is way too hot for you. What? Are you actually rich or something? Is this the part where I ask for a raise? Or hang on, was it a physical thing? Wait here. I'm gonna go get a ruler. Butch pulled away angrily. Clear. Is there any way I can convince you to just not be yourself right now? Not a chance.
DeMarco!
You know I have a terminal case of not knowing when to shut up. So, I sat down on the wheelbarrow full of dung and leaned back comfortably, my stomach growling at the smell. How did you two meet? How's a Babs? Does that mean you're single now? The look Butch gave me was disgusted. I returned it with an impish grin. You really have no concept of appropriate. Do you... Clear? We work in a second-hand shop. This is kind of what we do. Butch sighed and Babs tried unsuccessfully to suppress a smile. I think I like this one. Butch, she told him. Yeah, you would. Maybe you should just tell me why you're here. Butch said to her, I'm not sure if I have the energy to play around today. Well, that sounds familiar. Babs, come on! Babs' grin flickered and fell. Butch, Hal's been hiding out at my place for the last few months. He went missing yesterday. Butch's face didn't change, but he did fall silent. Babs seemed to be silently pleading with him to hear her out, and he was obviously considering it. Finally, he glanced over at me. Clear? I think we need a couple minutes. The Becks just got in with a new shipment. Will you go sign them in and restock, please? There were times to joke, and there were times to just leave people to their conversation. I had a hard time telling the difference sometimes, or most of the time, but I had learned that when Butch asked politely, it was probably for the best to just follow his lead. I nodded silently and made my way to the elevator at the back of the menagerie. In the elevator, I took a moment to consider the whole conversation I had just witnessed. Hal had been staying with Butch's ex-wife. That actually made a lot of sense. I knew Hal and Butch had been pretty famously tight, so the last place anyone would have expected Hal to go would be Butch's ex-wife. And what did that mean for Babs? Butch was one of the most formidable people I knew, but even he had spoken of Hal with a bit of awe. If Hal went to Babs for protection, God only knows what she must be capable of. Honestly, it probably meant she was exactly my type, i.e., a really bad idea. No, I wasn't really going to try to hook up with her, tempting though it may be, but she did strike me as someone who would play along with my attempts to get a rise out of Butch. I shook myself out of my thoughts and pressed the TC button on the panel. I felt the slowly becoming familiar lurch in my stomach. My hand instinctively reached out to brace myself against the wall as the tiny room began racing off to the left. That surprised the hell out of me the first time I'd ridden this thing. I had tried to figure out how any of it was possible at first, but pretty quickly decided I liked not having a migraine more. The elevator entered, its cruising speed, so I placed my hand on the other wall to prepare for the equally jarring deceleration. While I waited, my eyes scanned down the button panel again. There were 6 of them. Well, 9 if you count the door open, door close, we're all gonna die buttons. Besides the TC where I was going and the M from where I'd just been, there were also buttons for FD, our fine dining restaurant, LH, our love hotel, and one actually managed to fit in BOSEC, the Blood Orgy Suite and Event Center. The final button was at the bottom, and it just said D. Butch hadn't told me what that one went to, just to never go down there unless Satan himself was on my tail. I had decided that it was prudent to take him at his word on that one. I felt my weight shift towards my bracing hand. I tried not to think about how far I had traveled in the last 3 minutes. I hadn't stepped outside from the menagerie exit yet, but I knew the restaurant opened just outside Brussels, and that trip only took about 1:30. The elevator ground to a halt, and the doors opened to the thrift store. No customers. Fortunately, Butch had assured me that stealing from the place was impossible. But even in the supernatural realms, customers became pissy when they had to wait. The Becks were not customers, though, so they just had to put up with waiting. 4 of them stood next to the front counter, 3 boys and 1 girl. A pallet with several layers of boxes was floating about 6 inches off the ground next to them. As usual, their faces were identical and expressionless. Their blonde hair was cut in the same early Beatles bowl cut. Their eyes were the same deep black voids. "About time, asshole," the tallest of them grumbled. It always amused me that despite their appearance, they always sounded like middle-aged teamsters. "Deepest apologies, my tallest," I intoned mournfully while dipping into a florid bow. Standing back up, I slipped back into my normal speech. "Seriously, though, I'm really not. I was watching Butch meet up with the ex he hasn't seen in 50 years. Believe me, totally worth it." The tallest snorted. "Babs is back." "Huh? That poor guy. She's had centuries of experience manipulating men like him." "Hey, I'm still new here." This was the first I'd heard of her. "You guys want to fill me in on some backstory?" The girl shook her head. "Not our business, kid. We deal in inventory, not gossip. Union rules." Nothing wrong with a little idle conversation.
Munchkin!
"Call me that again and you'll lose a finger." "I believe you. Short stuff. Come on, I just want to know how large the pile of shit I'm standing in is." Another of the boys blew out a breath. "Look, we really don't pay much attention. She was here a lot. And then she wasn't. I know she worked for meth. So she spent most of her time down in the restaurant." I blinked in surprise. Didn't see that coming. Whatever. I'm pretty sure most of us have a past we're not so proud of. And working in the restaurant would make sense if she was on meth. The tallest spoke again. "Quit thinking like an idiot. Clear. METH. Monsters for the ethical treatment of humans. Babs used to make sure the people they served down in the restaurant were treated humanely and that they didn't suffer unnecessarily during the slaughtering process." "Oh, nice." She struck me as the humanitarian sort. Any idea why they split? Butch's old assistant kept on jokingly flirting with her, so Butch killed him. "Oh fuck. Really?" "No, not really. Now will you please sign the damn paperwork so we can get back to work?" I grabbed the outstretched clipboard, signed my name at the bottom, and handed it back. The tallest tore off the receipt copy and handed it back to me. The 4 of them walked in lockstep out of the door as I turned to begin the unloading process. Curious as I was about what Butch and Babs were talking about, I had to admit that this was my favorite part of the job. The paperwork identified this as estate sale procurements, which meant a 50-50 chance of it being junk or awesome. The Becks were good at picking out items of significance, but a well-loved children's toy or a serial killer's trophy collection had a tendency to set off that same bell in their heads. I was met with disappointment for the first 8 boxes. Well, mostly. I did find myself spending an inordinate amount of time studying a fascinating painting of what appeared to be a Soviet-era army marching across an ocean with the silhouette of the Golden Gate Bridge barely visible in the background. A pod of fish painted with the Soviet flag swam about the advancing army's feet. I decided to hang it behind the cash register so I could study it more in depth later. There was definitely something to it, since it took every ounce of concentration to pull my eyes off of it. I struck gold on the 9th box, where I found a translated copy of the Voynich manuscript, an unabridged version of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, 12 missing books of Homer, one of which was titled "That Time Achilles and Odysseus Totally Boned," a strange red hat that smelled like sulfur-flavored ambergris and looked like it was perpetually coated with sand, and a small bow complete with arrow-filled quiver that all appeared to be plated in gold. Pulling out one of the arrows, I noticed that they seemed to be quite intentionally phallic. I quickly double-checked everything in the box off the inventory list the Becks gave me and set it aside for butch set prices. I found a few other decent items scattered through the rest of the boxes, but I handled them myself due to us having very similar items already in stock. Mass-produced grimoires, a few tarot decks, a couple haunted toys, a number of enchanted pieces of clothing, things like that. At the bottom of the final box, since that's how these things always go for some reason, I found trouble. The moment I picked up the forest green book with "Hi"
Clear!
written in Comic Sans on the front cover, I knew there was no way anything good could come of it. But, of course, I immediately said, "Hi, book, nice to meet you," and opened it. The first line of the first page simply read, "Ha, you fucking idiot," and it began to glow red hot in my hands. I dropped it, since I had completely ignored the Moshe requirements of protective equipment when handling untested magical artifacts. On the floor, the book flipped, its pages towards the center, and began to emit a bubble of green light. "Oh, God damn it!" I yelled, and quickly ran behind the register to grab the canister of pure salt we kept under the counter for situations like this. I managed to get a circle drawn around the book just before the bubble burst, and a giant, hideous, praying mantis-looking thing flew directly at me. It hit the barrier with a dull thud, looked down at the circle of salt, and hissed audibly. I let out an audible breath as my heart pounded away in my chest. Immediately transforming into a woman with short red hair and piercing eyes. The wings stayed in place, though, flapping softly to keep her aloft and looking down in contempt at me. "Release me," she whispered fiercely at me. I stared back at her, wanting to think she was cute, but unable to get her insect form far enough out of my head to consider it. I know there is much we can learn from each other if we can negotiate a truce. We can find a way to coexist. Can there be a peace between us? Peace? No peace. Release me. Now! Man, Butch said you guys didn't have a sense of humor, but you just rolled with that one straight away. Rolled with what? Human? I said release me this instant! Wait, you mean those scriptwriters actually came up with realistic dialogue for that scene? Huh, who would have thunk it? She threw up her hands. Why must I always be caught by humans who make no sense? I think that might say more about you than me. Sweetie. The yellow door at the far end of the shop burst open, and a tall, lanky fellow covered in red-brown fur casually strolled in. "Jack," I yelled enthusiastically. So far as I knew, nobody had laid eyes on him since he disappeared through that door on my first day. Jack sauntered over to me and gave me a fist bump before clapping me on the shoulder with camaraderie. He glanced up at the fairy briefly, who bared a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth at him. He flipped her off in return. "Where you been? Butch told me you'd be okay," but I was starting to get a little worried. Jack reached into a pocket of fur and withdrew a small business card to hand over. In a small typeset, it simply said the back rooms. I flipped it over to see a small description of the itsy-bitsy teeny-weeny multiversal in-betweeny. Yep, that definitely clears it all up. He grinned at me. "Well, let me buy you a drink down in the restaurant before you head out tonight. I definitely owe you one." He nodded at me. Then he shot a questioning glance up at the fairy trapped in her circle of salt. "I have no idea. Butch told me how to trap her, but not what to do with her after. Any thoughts?" Jack shrugged and fired a finger gun at her. "That's a thought. It's iron rounds for fairies, right? Since I had absolutely no idea where Butch kept the iron bullets, it was probably for the best that he chose that moment to come through the elevator door. "What's all this then?" he asked, taking in the scene with a bewildered look. "Jack!" yelled Babs from behind Butch with delight. She ran towards him and launched herself into his surprised embrace, burying her face into his fur. The Chalamet squeezed out from between them and scrambled up to the top of Jack's head, chittering in annoyance, ever so slowly. I watched as Jack and Babs began to lose balance and tip backwards. It probably would have resulted in everyone sharing a good-natured laugh at their expense if they didn't fall directly onto the salt line. The fairy wasted no time flipping straight back into her praying mantis form and flying straight at me. I managed to duck underneath of her just before impact, but her back talons managed to swipe against my raised forearm, drawing a thin line of blood. She quickly made for the front door, but a quick shout of "Hey Siri, set Fey protection wards" from Butch blocked her exit with a cross of bright purple lines. She spun on us furiously, her face darting around the shop for another way out. Babs and Jack were pulling themselves back to their feet, but Butch was already in action, running through an aisle with his hands deftly swiping items off the shelves. "Clear."
Get the salt ready!
Butch shouted at me. Sensing that he was probably the largest threat in the room, the fairy went for Butch next. He slid to a stop at the end of the aisle and stood his ground. When she got close enough to him for Babs to let out a yell of concern, Butch reached into his pocket and threw a cloud of powder into her face. They must have been iron fillings or something, because she immediately shrieked and started trying to claw it out of her eyes. Butch moved in closer, an iron bar in his hand, ready to finish her off, but one of her flailing wings caught him in the head and sent him sprawling. She shook her insectile face, and her reddened eyes fell on me, standing in front of the cash register holding the bag of salt. Jack and Babs came at her from either side, but a powerful flap of her wings sent them flying. I stared dumbly at her as she began to race straight at me, her face filled with rage. I looked around helplessly for anything within reach that might help me in this fight. The Chekhov gun was too far away. Nothing nearby was made with iron. Really, the only thing within reach that might work was... I grabbed the painting of the Soviet army walking on water and held it up between me and the charging Fey. The impact never came. I lowered the painting just enough for me to look over the top and saw her examining the painting while tapping her chin thoughtfully with her long, thin tarsi. "Interesting," she said. "Is this intended as a Cold War propaganda piece? If so, which side is it for? A warning for the West or an aspiration for the East?" "I'm not sure," I replied, calmly walking around the counter and pretending to contemplate the painting while surreptitiously beginning to reform the salt circle around her. I thought at first that it was just a depiction of some kind of Orwellian future, but now I'm starting to wonder if it's something way more insidious. "This might actually be an original Alexander Samokvalov," she said, fascinated. "I don't actually know. We just got it in. I haven't had a chance to get it officially appraised yet. If you're interested, though, we might be able to make a deal." I stepped back and sprinkled the last bit of salt in the bag onto the completed circle. With a quick motion, I reached over and pulled the painting away, breaking her line of sight. Dismay filled her eyes as she looked down to realize she was trapped again. "Fuck me," she groaned. "Sorry," I said. "Really not interested when you're still in that skin. If you want to switch back to the redhead, though, we could talk about it." The fairy shot me a dirty look, but shifted back to her human form anyway. "If that is the cost of my freedom, I'll do what I must do." "You..." "No, I was kidding. Sorry, I have a lot of perversions, but formicophilia is not on the list." "How do you know what it is called then?" "I really don't have a good answer to that. I Google random things when I'm bored." "Then name your desire. Human, and allow me to return to my realm." Butch, Babs, and Jack had joined me around the circle at this point, and the two former lovers were exchanging a pointed look. Weirdly enough, Kid, Your fuck-up might have some unexpected benefits here. Babs and I were just coming to talk to you about it. Actually,
We need to track down Hal.
this shop is in some serious trouble if the Hellspawn managed to get a hold of him. He was safe over with Babs, but now that he's vanished again, we really need to do something about this. He looked over at the trapped fairy. How about that? Can you bring Hal to us? You did not trap me. Shopkeeper, my deal is not with you. Butch looked at me. All you, kid. Think you're ready to go solo? I smiled at him. I was born ready. It was pretty satisfying that I even got Jack to let out an exasperated groan with that one. All right, babe. What do you think? Can you bring Hal back to us? The fairy's eyes went distant. No. He has been shielded against interference by fairy magic. I don't know how, but I cannot touch him. Well, shit. How about information? Can you tell us anything about him? She nodded. 3 questions, 3 true answers, and you will give me my freedom? Fine, but no bullshit answers. Okay, no technically true, but only because homonyms exist. Answers, and nothing so cryptic that it only makes sense after we're done. You got me? Also, once you give us the answers, and I break the circle, you can't hurt any of us for trapping you. Agreed. And we shall all depart unharmed. All right. Where is Hal? What is the quickest way for us to get to him? And what will we need to do in order to successfully find him and bring him back? She closed her eyes briefly, as if scanning her hard drive. He is currently hiding in purgatory. The blue door at the back of the shop will bring you to the realm, but then you take the subway to Terrace 5 and catch the bus to the historical district. Once there, you must have with you a servant of heaven, a denizen of hell, and a man perpetually trapped in the mortal realm. Between the 4 of you, you will be able to track down a social media influencer who goes by the name of Razamataz, who will guide you to Hal. I cannot tell whether you will succeed in convincing him to return. The uncertainty that surrounds him is too deep to see clearly. But all other paths lead to certain failure. Bear in mind, these instructions are intended for you alone. If these others decide to leave you behind, these answers may no longer be truthful. That'll have to do. Thank you. And I broke the salt circle with my foot. The fairy immediately vanished with a crack of lightning. The 4 of us looked at each other for a moment. That was uncharacteristically straightforward for you. Clear, Butch said. So what's the point? We have most of our group already here. Wait, really? I said, surprised. Is Jack from hell? No. And the man trapped in the mortal realm? Wait. Clear. Hey. Story 3. An investigation into think tech. A cry for help. This may not be reality. I may be posting this to the abyss or not at all. Is this a cry for help, or all part of a greater plan larger than I can comprehend? My mind is rattled. It has been undone. This world is built on secrets, and I was one of the few who made a living uncovering them. My name is irrelevant now, but for years I've been a private investigator, priding myself on discretion and efficiency. I have lived a secluded life. The connections I have made have been fleeting at best. It's easy to be pessimistic and untrustworthy of people with what I have seen and uncovered in my time. Nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare I stumbled into at ThinkTech. As I try to piece together the fragments of my memory, I can't shake the feeling that some of what I remember might not be my own. ThinkTech stood as a fortress of innovation, its public face a beacon of hope for Alzheimer's and dementia patients. Commissioned by an anonymous employer, my mission was to delve into their brain imaging and altering technology. The deeper I dug, the more sinister the rumors became. Whispers of mind control, secret experiments, and people who vanished without a trace. I knew I needed to get in, to truly uncover their secrets. My entry into ThinkTech was facilitated not by subterfuge, but an invitation under the guise of a journalist, an aspiring writer in the medical technology field, ready to sing ThinkTech's praises. Of course, this would be of interest to the shareholders. The facility was a shrine to ThinkTech's triumphs, with portraits of beaming scientists and heartfelt accounts of miraculous recoveries. Yet, there was something off in the way the staff moved and interacted, an undercurrent of dread that intuition whispered to me. The hallways didn't evoke a feeling of positivity or optimism from patients being treated, just a feeling that this was all a mere plastic facade ready to be torn down, exposing the hidden truths. Staff continued to move in a hush-hush manner, avoiding my gaze as I was shown around the sterile facility. In my research, Dr. Emily Carter emerged as a person of interest, a neuroscientist celebrated for her breakthroughs, yet enshrouded in mystery. No backstory, no origin, as if she appeared out of thin air. It took some digging, but I discovered she was deeply involved in classified projects. I knew I needed to talk to her, try and get her to reveal things not known. As I was being shown around the facility, I was introduced to a few of the scientists working on the many projects under ThinkTech's umbrella. Amongst them, Dr. Emily Carter. For such a decorated scientist, she was very quiet and subdued. She was successfully avoiding my not-so-subtle gaze, and my attempts to grab her attention were proving futile. Pulling myself away from the obviously meticulously planned PR spiel of the numerous scientists, I walked towards Dr. Carter. Before I could get a word out, her eyes darted to the corners of the room, pointing out the multitude of cameras following everyone's every move. It was clear that I wouldn't be able to get any information out of her here. I extended a handshake and smiled. She reciprocated the action. With a bead of sweat appearing in her forehead, she uttered the words, "Hillside View," after which she turned and left. I was taken aback at first, caught off guard, confused. When I started to ponder on the words "Hillside View," I was reminded of a case of mine from many years ago, of an insurance scam gone wrong. A hotel was burnt down with families stuck inside. The owner of the hotel couldn't afford to keep the hotel in good condition, its floors warped and twisted, hallways in various states of disrepair. He burnt it down to get a new start, one that never came. All that is left of the Hillside View Hotel is a charred mass of wood and bricks. The doorway to the lobby still stands, almost in defiance of what the owner chose to do. What could Dr. Carter possibly have meant by this? Was it linked to ThinkTech? Was it a warning? Could it possibly be an opportunity to meet? Hoping it was the latter, I knew I needed to pay the Hillside View Hotel a visit. I pulled up to the hotel in my car. It appeared dark, a black mass imposing against the already night sky. I sat in my car wondering why I was here. How did Dr. Carter know this place was linked to me? How was she able to see through my journalist identity? Before I could comprehend what was happening, a shrouded figure opened my car's back door, sat down and closed the door behind them. I didn't dare look back, not wanting to catch a bullet to the head. I waited. I waited for the figure to speak, to shed some light on my current situation. I waited. Looking in the rear view, I caught a glimpse of their silhouette, appearing almost familiar but shrouded in darkness. "You don't know what you're getting into," she whispered. "You don't know how far this goes. You might not come back," a tremble in her voice. Extending out of the dark, a hand appeared, holding out a key card and an address. It appeared glinting in the moonlight, a gateway to the next chapter. I took the items and inspected them. Before I could say anything, the figure was gone, fleeing into the night. I debated on what my next move should be, pondering my safety. However, my drive to seek out the unknown forever pulls me deeper into the darkness. Following the address, it brought me to some woods on the outskirts of the city, illuminated only by the glow of the night sky. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, guiding my car deeper into the dense woods. Not knowing what lied ahead, the trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches intertwining above to form a claustrophobic canopy that blotted out what little light there was. The air grew heavier, and the forest seemed to swallow the gravel road, each turn leading me further from the world I knew. The address scribbled on a piece of paper sat on the passenger seat. a cryptic beacon given to me by a shrouded figure outside a part of my career from many years ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving into a trap, the sinister atmosphere mirroring a dark chapter from my past. Years ago, I had navigated through a different kind of darkness. I spiraled into a void where the days blurred together in a haze of grief and self-destruction. I repressed the source of this pain to allow me to keep going, to allow me to uncover the treachery of the world as repentance for my previous lack of action. The suffocating forest now felt like an echo of those days, each tree a reminder of the walls I had built around myself. I feel now a familiar sense of dread, an abyss threatening to engulf me. The memories of sleepless nights and relentless self-reproach surged back with every mile, intertwining with the present danger. Yet, just as I clawed his way out of that personal hell, I knew I had to confront whatever lay ahead, hoping this journey into the shadows would bring me one step closer to salvation. As I emerged into the forest clearing, the sight before me was nothing short of surreal. In the midst of the dense, wild underbrush and towering trees, a solitary door stood erect, untouched by time or nature. The clearing itself was unnaturally circular, the surrounding trees bending away as if repelled by some unseen force emanating from the door. There were small walls either side, indication of a staircase being just beyond the door, its surface polished and pristine, unnaturally so. The door's presence was profoundly eerie, a stark contrast to the raw, untamed forest. It stood as an anomaly, an element so out of place that it twisted the fabric of reality around it. A cold breeze whispered through the clearing, rustling leaves and carrying with it a faint, almost inaudible hum that set me on edge. The door's handle gleamed, seemingly inviting, yet menacing. I felt a chill creep up my spine, as if the very air around him held its breath, waiting for him to make a move, watching. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but an inexplicable pull drew me closer, compelling me to face whatever mystery lay beyond the uncanny threshold. Inside the door was a long, narrow staircase descending deep into the darkness, an unsettling invitation into Think Tech's inner sanctum. The contrast was jarring. One moment I was surrounded by the organic, chaotic life of the forest, and the next, I was staring into a passage that seemed to defy the natural order. The staircase was made of cold steel, each step sharp and perfect, almost as if I was the first person to ever come across this place. Bright, shimmering lights lined the walls at precise intervals, casting ghostly shadows that danced in the periphery of my vision. The air that wafted up from below was damp and musty, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and unsettling. With each step I took, the walls seemed to close in tighter, the oppressive silence broken only by the echo of my footsteps. The narrowness of the staircase amplified my unease, making me feel as though I was descending into the bowels of the earth, towards an unseen presence, a malevolent force waiting at the end of my journey. Yet I continued downward, each step a reluctant but necessary advance into the unknown. Finally reaching the bottom of the stairwell, I was enveloped by a silence so profound it felt suffocating, each breath a struggle against the oppressive stillness. Turning back around to look up at the staircase I had just descended, the world felt impossibly far away. In contrast to the staircase, this room was not well lit, lit up only by the glow of the staircase. Shadows pressed in from all sides, thick and impenetrable, as if the darkness itself were alive, conspiring to swallow me whole. I moved forward cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the eerie void, until I stumbled upon a gallery that sent a chill through my bones. Lining the walls were photographs of missing persons, faces frozen in time, eyes wide with terror and desperation. It was immediately clear that these were captives, not volunteers. The name Project Mind's Eye was scrawled ominously across a large, decrepit sign hanging crookedly on the wall. My stomach churned as I realized the true horror of this place. Project Mind's Eye was not merely for observation, but for control. In the dim light, I could make out grotesque diagrams pinned to the walls, showing devices implanted in the subjects' skulls. These crude contraptions were designed to strip individuals of their autonomy, turning them into mere puppets for some sinister purpose. The cold, clinical nature of the setting clashed horribly with the reality of the human suffering it inflicted. My mind raced, the enormity of the revelation crashing over me like a wave. Each photograph, each diagram, each desperate face etched into my memory as I stood there, a lone witness to the depths of human depravity. As I documented this horror, the realization struck me. ThinkTech was expecting me. My every move had been orchestrated. They didn't need to hunt me down. They knew where I was at every moment. The door was opened, not to pursuers, but to guide me and others potentially like me deeper into the dark. A symphony of mechanical hums filled the air, the source elusive yet omnipresent. I felt rooted to the spot, a silent observer to unseen horrors. A door creaked open at the end of the room, its ominous presence beckoning me to uncover what lay beyond. But as I stood there, staring into the gaping maw of further darkness, my usual controlled disposition faltered. The weight of the photographs and diagrams, the faces of the missing and tormented, pressed heavily on my psyche. Fear surged through me, raw and unrelenting, eroding my resolve. My instinct for self-preservation screamed louder than my curiosity. I could feel the icy tendrils of dread creeping up my spine, tightening their grip around my heart. With a shaky breath, I made the decision to retreat. Each step backward a surrender to the overwhelming terror that had seized me, the suffocating silence, the oppressive shadows, and the horrific revelations of Project Mind's Eye were too much to bear. As I turned away from the open door, I could only hope that retreating now would give me the strength to return and face this nightmare another day. My escape was a calculated retreat, not a desperate flight. For days, I didn't leave my apartment trying to piece together what I had witnessed. What was their plan? How far had they spread? The feeling of being watched was an unshakable companion. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my bones. The shadows outside seemed to thicken and become larger with every night that passed, taking on a life of their own. From my window, I noticed them lurking on the streets below, their indistinct forms blending seamlessly with the darkness. They stood still, their presence ominous and foreboding, as if they were waiting for the right moment to strike. I pulled the curtains, hoping to shut out the unnerving sight, but the sense of being watched persisted. Moving through my apartment, I could almost feel these shadowy figures within the complex itself, lingering just beyond my door in the hallways, their vague silhouettes flickering in the dim light. Every creak and rustle seemed amplified, my senses on high alert as paranoia gnawed at me. The walls of my sanctuary felt increasingly thin, unable to keep out the creeping dread that these figures brought with them. It was clear that whatever dark forces I had encountered in the forest had followed me home, and there was no escaping their watchful eyes. These shadowy figures affirmed ThinkTech's awareness of my investigation. The final confrontation was not violent, but a quiet breach of my sanctuary through the front door in the dead of night. In the pitch black, there was a presence. Dr. Carter stood before me with a group of men, quiet and with blank expressions. "We are only trying to help," she pleaded, her voice a siren's call, beckoning for my compliance. "This is not down to us, but to those that can't be seen. Just as I stretched out my hand to you to bring you in, they stretched out theirs to bring us in." A laptop was presented to me, the only file on it a video titled Patient Eye. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard before double-clicking the icon. The footage, grainy and unfocused, showed a woman strapped to a chair, electrodes attached to her head. The room was dimly lit, but had a sense of familiarity to it, evoking a feeling I had a few nights before. Had this been what lay beyond the door that I turned away from? The video played, revealing the woman's face wide with terror, her body convulsing as she struggled against the restraints. Her screams echoed through the speakers, piercing and desperate. "Where am I? Who are you?" Her pleas remained unanswered. A scientist stepped towards the center of the room. "The time is 1900 hours on the 10th of March 2004. We are here with Patient I, Emily. Emily has struggled through the foster system due to her mental health. Emily has displayed signs of childhood dementia. She has trouble concentrating, understanding, learning and communicating, frequent personality changes, severely disturbed sleep and behavioral issues such as hyperactivity. She is the perfect test subject to test out our new treatment. From this video, it was clear ThinkTech was providing this treatment without proper permission or authority. Pursuing progress, no matter the cost. The video continues with the scientist explaining the procedure. Our treatment seeks to implant a device into the patient's brain. We will be stimulating it after insertion with an electronic pulse provided by the electrodes around the patient's head. This will activate said device to act as a bridge between various sections of the brain, allowing information to be stored and transferred on demand. A second brain, if you will. Dementia patients will no longer have to rely on the fragility of their own organic structures. The device will pick up every impulse sent through it. "What do you want with me?" the child screamed, holding back tears. The chilling intensity of her voice sending shivers up my spine. I could see the raw fear etched into her features, her gaze darting around the room as if trying to escape the horrors of the reality she was in. A new figure stepped into the frame, a much older man. His expression was one of cold, clinical detachment, a stark contrast to the girl's frantic terror. He glanced at the monitors, then at his team, his voice calm and commanding. "Initiate the sequence," he ordered. Not one person flinched or stalled for even a moment. Beginning the sequence in synchronous harmony, like drones, no sign of unease or uncertainty that they might not be right. The girl's screams intensified for a moment, then morphed into a monotonous drone. Her eyes glazing over, she fell silent. Even from the video, the silence in the room was palpable. It was as if time had stopped, everyone waiting for the child to speak and show signs of life. "I'm not alone in here anymore, am I?" Her voice, now void of emotion, repeated the haunting refrain like a broken record. The room around her seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows on the grainy footage appearing to shift and writhe as if alive. The older man watched impassively, taking notes as the girl's words grew increasingly disjointed, her mind fracturing under the relentless pressure. "They are in my head. They control me. They are telling me things. They want more." The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing every twitch and spasm, every flicker of madness that crossed her eyes. Her transformation from a terrified human to a hollow shell was recorded in excruciating detail. The video ended abruptly, the screen going black, leaving me in a silence that felt louder than the screams. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat clung to my skin. The shadows in my apartment seemed to stretch and lengthen, the memory of the girl's tortured cries echoing in my mind. Who are they? What did she mean by, "I'm not alone in here anymore, am I?" All these questions raced through my mind. I briefly forgot I was in my room surrounded by ThinkTech's personnel. Then it clicked. The child, Emily, Doctor. Carter watched as the realization came to my face. Too stunned to speak, Doctor, Carter filled the air not with her quiet and frightened voice that she had presented previously, but one similar to the cold and clinical nature of the older man in the video. "I wouldn't be where I am today without them. They made me who I am. You only need to let them in." In that moment, be it clarity or madness, I grasped ThinkTech's true horror. They had not merely unlocked minds, they had opened doors to realms unfathomable, and within those depths lurked unseen powers. I was left with the question of how much of Emily is truly left. Is her body merely acting as a conduit for whatever them is, or is she still in there, with no control of the wheel, witnessing whatever horrors she has been made to watch in the last 20 years? I was told what to do, how to fix people, rid people of their pain, bring people's loved ones back from the brink. Can't you see that? I know what happened to you. Don't you want rid of those memories? The pain? Doctor, Carter beckoned to me. The horror of ThinkTech's true intentions began to hit me. The anonymous company that had hired me was ThinkTech itself. They sought out reclusive individuals like myself, those who had been through hardship, knowing no one would come looking when we vanished or changed beyond recognition. I was just a pawn in a game repeated many times before. ThinkTech slowly amassing an army of meat puppets. Do ThinkTech even know what they are doing, or have they collectively lost control? Being controlled by an invisible entity or entities? The shadows in my room began to get longer and darker, enveloping all that is around me. A sudden dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled backward, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet. When I regained my bearings, I found myself sitting alone in the very same dimly lit room from the tape. I was disoriented and afraid. The same metallic smell and hum was present from before. I knew there was no point screaming out for help. I was truly alone. No one could possibly help me. I began to feel a tingling sensation in the back of my head. It was as if I could feel another presence in my mind, a sinister consciousness lurking just beyond the edges of my awareness. At first, it was just whispers, faint echoes that seemed to emanate from the depths of my own thoughts. But as I struggled to make sense of the situation, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a cacophony of voices, each one vying for control. I could feel them rifling through my memories, rewriting them, twisting them into something unrecognizable. Panic surged within me as I realized that I was no longer alone inside my own head. I tried to fight back, to assert my own will, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with my bare hands. The presence in my mind was relentless, a puppeteer pulling at the strings of my consciousness with chilling precision. Every thought, every action was no longer my own. It was dictated by the unseen force that now held sway over me. I watched in horror as my body attempted to move of its own accord, like a marionette on strings, carrying out commands that I couldn't even comprehend. It was as if I were a prisoner in my own mind, forced to witness the unfolding nightmare from behind a veil of helplessness. And as the realization sank in that I was no longer in control, that I was nothing more than a vessel for this malevolent force, I knew that there was no escape. I was trapped, bound to this entity that now inhabited my mind. What was its goal? What was its purpose? Before I could work this out, I was thrust back into the darkness, encased within the walls of my head, a space that seemed to close in with malevolent intent. An infinite darkness. I was faced with the ultimate violation, not of home or privacy, but of self. In this new reality where consciousness could be commandeered, the terror lay in discerning what remained truly mine. Dr. Carter's voice, so cold and detached, echoed in my mind. I was told what to do, how to fix people, rid people of their pain. How many people are not who they seem? How many people have been changed? Think tech are creating conduits for something beyond our comprehension to peer through, no longer watching us but taking control. I awoke in my apartment, sat at my desk. I knew I had to expose them, to warn the world. But as I sat in my dimly lit study, paranoia wrapped around me like a vice. Every shadow seemed to hide a pair of watching eyes. Every sound a whisper of something unseen. My own thoughts no longer felt like my own. In the end, it wasn't the fear of what think tech could do to my body that paralyzed me. It was the knowledge that they had already claimed my mind. The true horror of think tech was not just in their experiments, but in the realization that I might never know which of my thoughts were truly mine and which were theirs. Everything I see and do can be altered, changed, generated. For all I know, I'm stuck inside my own mind prison, being placated by them, by being allowed to write this out, never to be seen by a soul, only existing within the bounds of my head. As I type this, I feel myself further falling into paranoia and madness. I'm unsure if these are my words or theirs. Is this a warning? Or a trap laid by them? I share this, not knowing if it's a desperate attempt by what's left of myself to reach out, or if it's think tech using me to spread their influence further. To whoever reads this, beware. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Story 4. I was trapped in a pitch-black room. It turned out I was part of a horrifying experiment. A few weeks ago, I woke up in hell. I know this might sound dramatic, but once you'd been in my shoes, you would have thought the same thing. I really hope you never have to endure even a fraction of what I had experienced. I'm currently in a hiding spot and away from any real danger, so I thought it was the ideal time to write down the past weeks, in hope someone can understand my situation. Last month, I woke up lying on a cold concrete floor, my head pounding like an elephant had trampled on it, and I felt like I was barely wearing anything. My hands only felt a skimpy patient gown. It smelled horribly of excrement, which someone had tried to conceal with disinfectant instead of washing the gown thoroughly. I sat up and screamed in panic as everything went black. I really thought I was blind at that moment until my vision cleared and I could see a bright crack under the door. I was in a room with no lights. I leaned over the gap and tried to see anything that would tell me where I was. Because I had no idea how I got here, my memories went back to a time when I was sitting calmly in a diner, my girlfriend Flo and her little brother Benny across from me. That was all I knew. But wherever I was, I didn't belong here. Not a single soul deserved to be here. Through the gap, I could see a lit corridor surrounded by several dark doors. Mine was one of them. Had I been accidentally locked up in a prison or a mental institution? That couldn't be possible. In my whole life, I've only had several bouts of depression like any person in their 20s and frequent sleep problems. But I've never been the kind of person who bangs their head against walls or plucks out their hair in a manic episode. After spending the next 2 or 3 hours, I completely lost track of time, calling for help and exploring the empty room. I suddenly heard a voice coming from the other side of the room. It was a deep, male voice with a croaking aftertone. Screaming won't do you any good. Brother, it'll just ruin your vocal cords. Then everyone's gonna think you're a chain smoker. I couldn't believe my ears. My panic and despair dropped by half when I heard his voice. It was the first time since I woke up that I found some sense of normality in my terrible situation. "Who are you?" I said out loud, pressing my head against the wall, hoping he would answer and confirm that I wasn't imagining him. "I'm locked up here just like you." "Brother," I heard him smirk. "How long?" I asked. "Maybe a few days. It could be a few weeks or months. I bet even you don't know how long you've been here." How right he was. He seemed very confident and relaxed as he spoke, which made me think he had probably spent a long time here. "Do you know where we are?" "Definitely not the Radisson Blu. I think they're keeping us here for some sick experiment." I swallowed loudly when I heard the word experiments. I've read many books and seen many films where people were involuntarily or voluntarily put in situations where their psyche was put to the test. I think one of those works was about the Stanford prison experiment or something like that, but I knew it was based on true events. In any case, I shuddered at the thought that I could possibly be part of a human experiment. Given the conditions I had to spend time in, I suspected the worst. "What kind of experiment could this be?" I asked my neighbor. "I don't know. They haven't done anything to me yet. At least I don't think so." I waited, spellbound. When I sleep, I often have nightmares about people in protective suits poking around on my body. It always feels so real and painful, but dreams are always real, right? And every time I wake up, I feel around my body and find nothing. I think I'm going crazy. "Brother, but doesn't anyone come to feed us? You can't be here the whole time without eating or drinking anything." "Only when I'm falling asleep. They put a tray in the room, right next to the crack in the door so I can see it. On the tray is always the same disgusting food. A dry piece of white bread, a spoonful of porridge and a piece of fruit, usually a couple of slices of pear that are really mushy, and a cupful of water. Then you always have to push the tray through the crack at the end. Only think about leaving the tray with you and you can bite the dust." I sank to the ground and listened to his words with a mixture of despair and hopelessness. I didn't know what would happen to me if I kept doing what my neighbor had been doing the entire time, sitting in the dark forever, losing track of time, eating only the bare minimum to avoid starving, slowly but surely going mad and not getting any answers. "We'll definitely find a way out," I said determinedly. "They can't just keep us here like this and never let us out. At the first chance we can..." "I've tried everything. Brother, I'm sorry I gotta take away all your hope, but we're at their mercy. The only way out of here is to not touch the tray and just go to sleep." His words hurt my soul. Fear rose up inside me again. "Have you tried?" I asked cautiously. "Like I said, I've tried everything. But the survival instinct can be a real asshole. I don't know why, but the way he expressed his words was the height of the blackest humor and didn't fit my current state of mind at all. So I just had to laugh. I laughed so loudly and ugly that I couldn't stop. In the distance, I heard my neighbor laughing as well, which only made the whole thing worse. I laughed like I've never laughed before in my life. Suddenly, I was reminded of the diner, my last known memory before I woke up here. In the memory, I saw myself laughing too, Flo and Benny joining in. It was like a Bill Burr stand-up show. I really enjoyed the moment, and I think my neighbor was glad that he hadn't lost his laughter after all this time. The two of us kept talking for a few more hours. Most of the time, we talked less about our precarious situation and more about things from our lives outside the room. I told him about Flo, how I met her and how we spent our time at college together before I dropped out. I also told him about my brother Charlie, who I lost in a car accident. As I talked about him, I realized how the pain of losing him hurt way more than anything that had happened to me since I woke up in the room, or that I feared could happen in the future. Nothing came even close to the gravity of his death. I loved Charlie more than anything. My neighbor listened carefully and then told me a bit about himself. How he dropped out of school at the age of 15 in order to work and support his sick mother. She suffered from multiple sclerosis and only made it until he turned 20. He then slipped into drug addiction and, in his words, spent the last 5 years simply cracking up. It went on like this until he announced that he wanted to sleep. "You should lie down too, brother," he said sleepily. "Especially when you're hungry. They don't let anything inside till you're dozed off." I was about to tell him that I didn't feel like sleeping at all, but then I heard snoring from next door. I lay down on the hard floor and cursed those who hadn't even thought about putting a mattress or at least a pillow in there. I didn't like doing it, but if I wanted to at least try to sleep, I just had to. I took off my gown so that I was stark naked and folded it into a pillow, which I put under my head. I'm always very picky about my pillows, because for me, that's the most important material for a safe sleep. At home, I could only sleep on an orthopedic neck pillow. My sleeping issues could sometimes be that bad. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, which could also be the wall, an endless darkness without any light or warmth. My neighbor appeared in front of me. I heard his voice, which had probably become so croaky from all the screaming, and I imagined what he might look like. I imagined how we would have crossed paths in another life, both of us at our lowest point and each other's support. I would help him with his withdrawal, and we would become best friends. Flo and her brother Benny appeared in front of me, sitting in the diner. Each of us was drinking a chocolate milkshake. Benny wasn't taking the ice cream very well, as he was holding his head and waiting for the brain freeze to wear off. I laughed at his funny expression, but Flo suddenly slapped me on the shoulder, looking all worried. She stammered something I couldn't hear. She took Benny in her arms. He looked very strange now, as if he was about to throw up at any moment. For some reason, I still found this amusing, and I continued to laugh while Flo cried and held Benny close. Benny threw up something that didn't look like food or any other substance resembling puke. It looked like a turquoise and slippery tentacle. The suction cups looked at me like eyes and were so irregularly shaped that any trypophobic person would gag at the sight of it. The tentacle hung motionless in the air. Benny was choking with every second. Flo was sobbing and her eyes were getting redder and redder. My vocal cords were still only emitting laughter. A fat waitress suddenly appeared next to me and, completely disregarding the circumstances, placed a tray in front of me. On it was a dry piece of white bread, the smallest pile of porridge, a banana full of brown spots that I hate, and a cup full of water. The diner's lights went out as quickly as they had appeared. Flo, Benny and the tentacle disappeared from my sight, and my laughter stopped. I was back in the dark room where I had woken up today, or yesterday, or the day before, with no memories. Only the room was no longer as pitch black as usual, but faded into a greyish light emanating from the side of the door. My eyes rolled towards the door, where a pair of arms wrapped in latex gloves held a tray in their hands and carefully placed it on the floor. As he leaned forward, I dimly recognized that he was wearing a decontamination suit. As I became more awake and my mind clearer, I found myself faced with a grave dilemma. If I simply stood up and lunged at him, I would have a chance to get out of this place. But if I remained in this position and gave the impression that I was asleep, the man in the suit would leave me here alone with the gross food, and I would have to hope for another attempt, if it ever came. As the man in the suit pushed the tray towards me, he looked at me and our eyes met. Even though I was just staring into a gas mask with integrated eye protection, the man backed away and pulled out a walkie-talkie. I wasn't sure what he was saying because he was stammering so much, but it was obvious that he caught me awake. I looked at his legs and saw that he was shaking. He was scared. At that moment, I didn't care what he was so scared of. Though, I wanted to take advantage of every chance I had. I got up from the floor and slowly staggered towards him, making the most disturbing expression on my face. The man walked backwards until he reached the wall and was at my mercy. The grey light completely surrounded me now, and I felt like I could see colours for the first time in years. I grabbed the man by his suit and shoved him into the room. His whole body was trembling. I looked him up and down. "Give me your suit," I said, mock croaking. He didn't hesitate and took off his green overalls and gas mask, until in the end, there was only a lanky boy in his underwear. He looked barely older than 20. He was sweating all over, and I could see a small yellow puddle on his feet. Poor bastard. I put on the hazmat suit, the gas mask and his rubber boots. In the suit pockets, I found the key to the room. Before I closed the door behind the boy, I said, "You'll be out of here soon." I would have liked to take more care of him, but he wasn't the one who was trapped here. I first went past my neighbor's door and knocked quietly. He didn't make a sound. I asked him if he was awake and could answer me. No response. I pressed my ear against the door and only heard his snoring. I tried to open the door with the key, but it didn't click. There was probably an individual key for each door in the hallway. I quickly whispered to him that I would be back soon and went down the hallway. It really felt like mental institution. There were the same dark steel doors on each side of the hallway. The floor was completely covered in concrete, and several fluorescent lights flickered on the ceiling. At the end of the hallway, I passed some empty hospital beds and cleaning equipment. I walked through a maze of more hallways made of nothing but walls until I finally found a slightly open door from which strange noises were coming. I heard people mumbling, squeaking boots and clinking metal cutlery. I got closer and closer to the door until I could understand some things more clearly. A man and a woman were discussing something excitedly. "His numbers are dropping. We need to do it now. Do you really want to risk the possibility that he could be dangerous if you cut him open?" It worked with the last anomaly before it died. That was different. That anomaly was 58 years old and suffered from heart problems. We're dealing with a much younger specimen here, who is also still going through puberty. "How long have you been doing this job? Have you ever been down the other hallways and looked at these creatures? Every day I have to bring this filthy food to the worst kinds of humanity and look at their faces. They may look different on the outside, older, younger, taller, shorter, or sicker and healthier, but at the core they're all the same. We are only doing them a favor." There was silence after that, which made me think that the woman had given in. Curiously, I dared to look into the room, as inconspicuously as possible. Another man in a hazmat suit and a woman in a gas mask and surgical gown were bent over a hospital bed. The woman took a scalpel and worked on the body of the person who was lying motionless on the bed. I leaned closer to get a better look, when suddenly the hinges of the door squeaked and exposed me. The man in the suit looked at me in surprise, but the woman seemed to have been startled by the noise because she frantically cut into the patient's chest before turning around too. The patient suddenly woke up and screamed loudly, his chest heaving. At that moment I realized it was a little boy. He had curly hair and green eyes and loved chocolate ice cream more than anything. It was Benny. The man in the suit acted quickly and pulled out a knife and approached Benny. I lunged at him and knocked it out of his hand. We struggled for a while, with him having the upper hand. He was very strong and punched me pretty hard. but I fought back as much as I could. I did everything to stop him from picking up that knife again. Meanwhile, Benny got up from the bed, still screaming and his chest bulging out. His screaming suddenly turned into a terrible wheezing sound, as if he was about to vomit his intestines out at any moment. The woman in the surgical gown approached him cautiously, but before she could do anything, Benny knocked her out of the way with full force, leaving her lying motionless on the floor. I was still fighting with the man, but finally managed to grab him under the nose and push it up, causing him to release me from his handle in pain. I quickly ran to Benny, although I didn't know what to do. "Benny."
It's me!
I shouted, hoping he would recognize me, but the sight of him told me that I was standing in front of something completely different from Benny. I would only recognize this creature in my worst dreams. Benny's wheezing got louder, and eventually gigantic, turquoise and slippery tentacles sprouted from his mouth, chest and eyes. I was frozen and didn't know how to feel. I knew that creature wasn't Benny. I knew I'd seen it in my dream. I knew it was real, and I knew it was my fault. Its suction cups stared at me again, uneven and disgusting. Before I knew it, it reached out and sucked itself onto me. The pressure was so strong that I felt like I was being sucked into a deep black hole, even blacker than the darkness it had to endure in the room. Story 3. Their eyes are changing. This all started about a week ago. Please hear me out. I need your help.
I need help!
Please don't write me off as crazy.
I'm not!
Just over a week ago, it was an average Sunday. I was talking to my girlfriend, Lucille, on our couch, watching TV, when I realized something was off. It was her eyes. Her eyes had never been green before. I always loved how her brown eyes complemented her chestnut hair and her fair skin, yet here she was with green eyes. When I noticed, I must have made a weird face because she stopped our chat about the show we had been watching and leaned in, almost close enough to feel her breath hit my face. She gave a small smirk and asked me, "Is everything all right? You look concerned." I closed my eyes, hoping it was some sort of visual illusion, and shook my head, and before I looked at her again, I responded swiftly, No, it's all right. It looked like your eyes were green instead of brown. It's weird, I just must have seen it wrong or something." When I finally looked up at her, she was turned away from me. I couldn't see what she was doing, but her hand was up by her face, and she had a soft chuckle before replying, "Well, obviously you must have seen wrong. We all know my eyes are brown, right?" She chuckled a bit more and she looked back at me with brown eyes, but it all felt off. The rest of the night was normal, but that moment lingered in the back of my mind. Not that her eyes were green as much as how odd her response was. We watched a few more episodes of the show, with Lucille's head leaned on my shoulder, arm wrapped around the back of my neck, and hand extended onto my other shoulder before we went to bed. I guess I should have found it odd, but the whole rest of the night she did not let me leave her sight. It wasn't concerning to me at the time because she kept trying to keep a conversation going, but honestly, it is a bit weird when I go to take a leak and I feel her eyes pierce the back of my head. As we went to bed, I stared at the ceiling considering the events before eventually passing out. The next few days were just as ordinary as ever. God, I wish that was the case for every day of the past week and a half. But on Friday, another weird occurrence happened. It was right before we were leaving for our date. I'd placed my phone down next to her purse in the middle of the coffee table before I went to the bathroom quickly. Now I know I had passed by my girlfriend in the foyer before I made it to the bathroom in the hallway. Now, I know this was not very gentlemanly, but I had peed with the door open, so I would have seen her pass by me, so I can confirm she didn't just walk there. But by the time I left the bathroom, there she was in the entryway of our bedroom at the opposite end of the hallway from where the foyer was. I actually jumped back a bit, she scared me so much. She laughed a little before asking once again, "Is everything all right? You look scared." I was dazed at the moment, but I quickly found my footing and voice rumbling deep in my throat. "Yeah, I might sound crazy, but you were just in the foyer." "Ha! I sound crazy saying it, but you were just there in the foyer. How the hell did you end up there? As the words left my mouth, there was no gain in confidence, especially when she responded, I don't know that you should be driving tonight. Got yourself in the wrong frame of mind, because I was standing here when you were walking to the bathroom. I waved to you and everything. I just thought you were ignoring me. But now I understand it's because you're hallucinating. Such a much better explanation. Are you okay? She was smiling during the whole sentence. At the time, I thought it was because my confusion was amusing to her. But now I think I understand that it is because her causing my confusion is amusing to her. It didn't help when I walked back into the living room to grab my phone and noticed her purse was no longer in the middle of the coffee table, but in the corner. Now, that might seem like an easy detail to mess up, and I don't mean to brag, but I have a fairly good memory. When I was in school, I wouldn't need to study a whole lot because I would have everything remembered fairly quickly and I was successful because I got all A's throughout high school and even into college. Hell, I went to UCLA using my quick study methods. My point is, I know where her purse was when I left, and I know where she was when I left to the bathroom. She confused me and made me feel crazy, but I am certain what I saw, or at least I think so. She insisted on driving to the restaurant, and I agreed because at the moment I was still very confused, and if I was wrong, then it would be wise not to drive. Our car ride was filled with music, and our date was filled with normalities. Well, that was until she went to the bathroom. I need to explain what happened before she went to the bathroom so you can understand what was off after she left for the bathroom. We were sat down by our waiter, who spoke in a soft Yorkshire accent. He was charming and offered us some great options to eat, and I actually ordered one of those options. I believe it was grilled chicken with fried rice and a special restaurant sauce. But after he left with our order, Lucille got up and left to go to the bathroom. Now, I'm no expert on female bathroom habits, but she was gone for a long time. She was gone so long that our food arrived. I waited a bit before my hunger pushed me to eat my dish while hers was greeted with the cold chills of the restaurant air, and the heat left the dish. Now this is the weird part. Our waiter had looped back around to ask about the check before noticing Lucille's food had not as much as a hole in it from a fork stabbing it. He frowned, and in his soft, brummy accent, he asked, "Did she leave you suddenly?" "I'm sorry. I'll see about getting that charge covered for you." I told him he didn't need to do that. She was just having bathroom troubles with the best poker face I had. Now, I am no Brit, but I know the difference in his accent when he sat us and took our order, and his accent when he asked me about Lucille leaving. I watched carefully where he went, and after a moment I stood up and tailed him, but he had disappeared into the kitchen without any clear line of sight on him. I decided then and there to head towards the bathrooms, and when I approached the women's bathroom, there was this lady walking towards the bathroom, so I asked her to check on my girlfriend for me. After a few moments, she walked back out, staring darts at my face, and rudely told me, "There is no woman in there. You must be confused. Maybe she left you." I was taken aback. First of all, why does everyone assume my girlfriend would just leave me? Secondly, and more importantly, where the fuck is Lucille? I apologized, probably shouldn't have, to the woman, and headed back to my table, and there was Lucille. At the table, with half her meal gone, I was utterly perplexed. What was happening? I sat down, and her wide eyes and curious tone cued me into the words I didn't hear while I was chewing on the complexity of the last 30 minutes. She had asked, "Where were you? You've been gone an awfully long time to go take a piss." I shook my head and barely answered her question before I asked a passing waiter for the check. We paid and went home, but the entire ride I sat confused. She kept hounding me about why I was gone so long, but I simply ignored it. I didn't forget about Sunday or Friday. I'll call it TV night and restaurant night for simplicity's sake, because the next Monday was even worse. The dread I felt when I got to work and my boss suddenly had blonde hair instead of his deep black hair emptied my mind of past worries and filled it with the current one. I work in an office, so I didn't get to speak to my boss as he passed by, but I leaned over and asked my co-worker if she saw the boss's hair, and she just shrugged her shoulders and said, "He probably just dyed it." I paused for a moment before I leaned back towards my desk and continued working. That whole day I barely saw my boss yet. Everything in the office was so off. And what I heard on the news when I got home did not help either. I got home before Lucille and wanted to tune out the insane thoughts that were liquefying my brain. So I turned on the TV, and before I could change the channel, the news caught my full attention. The waiter from our Friday restaurant date was missing. The exact waiter. I felt time freeze around me as my senses dulled until the only thing that was real was my inner voice telling me to run. I wanted to get up and get away, but the spaghetti that had replaced my legs weren't very good at running. I never had felt so closed in, but I knew my girlfriend wasn't getting home for at least another hour. I took a few minutes to breathe, and then I got up and packed my stuff. I made such a mess and knocked over so many things in my rush that when I left my bedroom, I heard the items in the closet collapse and knock the door open, but I had no time to fix any mess. I packed 2 suitcases and wrote a note for my girlfriend, just in case she was still the woman I had fallen in love with. My note gave away zero information, just a clear note that was written in red Sharpie that read, "I need to get away for a few days. I'll be back later." I got in my car and drove an hour away to my mum's house. She lives secluded in the woods in a small neighborhood. Lucille had only been there once, and I doubt she remembered her way back. She always sucked with directions. The whole drive I was so preoccupied with the waiter being missing since our date on Friday that I almost hit this wolf. Or maybe it was a coyote. I didn't notice when it was just standing in the middle of the road, staring at me, and so I had to slam on my brakes to avoid it. I waited a minute or two before it walked back into the woods. Once I made it there, I grabbed the suitcase and knocked on the door. My mom was surprised to see me, but she was elated to see me before she was worried that my visit was over relationship issues. I reassured her that it wasn't. I mean, it was, but not for the reasons she thought. If I am honest with myself and you all, I don't see my mom enough. I'm sure she's lonely sometimes. Her neighborhood doesn't have too many people her age to hang around, and my dad passed away a few years back. I miss him, but it might be good. He doesn't live in a world where his son runs back home because something is tricking him, going after him. I feel so crazy. I feel insane, but I feel like something is after me. My waiter's shifting accent and disappearance, my girlfriend's behavior and eyes, and my boss's hair changing. Sorry for the rant, but it was relieving to see my mom. I just told her I missed her and wanted to spend time with her. I didn't want her worrying about what I'm sure she'd perceive as my mental health. That whole night was so relaxing. I spent hours just talking to my mom and having fun. I felt relaxed for the first time since before I went on my date. We talked and played some card games, and she made the best tasting burger I ever had in my life. When I asked her what made the burger special, she just replied, "Well, your mom makes any burger special, of course." I laughed, but I would have loved the recipe. As we called it a night, I went to sleep in my childhood bedroom. I saw all the books on my shelf from when I was younger, and I noticed the fairy tales and kids' books especially. Rapunzel, Otto Goes to the Beach, Little Red Riding Hood, and Hansel and Gretel. I smiled at the books and remembered my mom tucking me and my brother into bed, reading us stories until we passed out. I never got rid of those old books. Even if their covers were worn down to dust, they meant so much. My parents were fervent about being parents, and it made my childhood so bright. I got in bed, and while it took me a bit to finally sleep, it was some of the best rest I had in a week. I rose from my bed the next morning, noticing I slept in. I got up and made quick work to get out of my room, and as soon as I opened the door, the aroma of flavors wafted past my nose and carried me towards the kitchen. As my body moved, I deciphered the smells. The smell of savory eggs, delicious bacon, the inviting smell of blueberry waffles, and maple syrup. I stopped dead in my tracks as I smelled the syrup, and I used all my might to not collapse and break. My mom was allergic to syrup. In fact, when I was about 8, my family went to this new diner about 30 minutes away from home, and we had begun eating, not realizing they dipped their waffle batter in syrup, and my mom immediately broke out into hives and nearly died then and there. My dad rushed me, my brother, and my mom to the ER. As my mom lay in the back seat, I was administering her an EpiPen. I remember every sound and smell vividly to this day, even the feeling of stabbing her thigh with the pen as air broke her past, the gasps stuck in her windpipes. I was frozen in place as my mom, or whatever that was, turned the corner and greeted me. "Hey!" "I saw you were sleeping, so I decided to go ahead and whip up something great. I made eggs and bacon, and I even made blueberry waffles. I had to go run to the store quickly to grab some syrup, and the whole time the cashier gave me this weird look like getting syrup early in the morning was some sort of crime. Is everything all right? You look concerned." I stared blankly at my mom as I about screamed, damn near collapsed, cried, and just begged this monster to kill me now. I don't know what it wants from me, but I want this to be over with. I didn't say anything for a minute, so this wolf in sheep's clothing asked me again, "Is everything all right? You look concerned." This time, though, as the sentence left my mom's mouth, a wicked smile began to overtake her face. I stammered, and my words might have not come out exactly like this, but I said something to the tune of, yeah, I'm fine. I just realized that I left my phone in my room. Just 1 second. I'll be back in a minute. As I turned around to walk back to my room and devise a strategy to leave this place, I got 2 ideas. The first being to turn around and ask this shell of my mother, "Hey Mom, are you going to eat with me?" She turned back, smiled, and responded, "Oh, yes, of course. I can't wait to enjoy those waffles with you." Now, my mom usually had waffles, just without syrup, so I needed to press further. "Can't let that syrup you got go to waste, right? Make sure you stack the syrup on thick for my waffles." I shot back at her. "Well, of course. What's a waffle without butter and some delicious syrup?" she exclaimed. I walked back into my room, locked the door, pushed the bookshelf in front of it, and gathered my items. I wasn't taking both suitcases. I needed to leave quickly once I leapt out my bedroom window. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, and my keys, and made sure I had a semblance of self before I opened the window and darted out to my car. I gave this thing too much warning when I left last time, so this time I hopped in my car and drove off. Based on the fact I hadn't heard from my girlfriend from when I left, never saw the waiter and my girlfriend together after she went to the bathroom. I assume this thing only takes one body at a time, and I wanted to test this. Oddly enough, Lucille gets Tuesdays off, so she would be at home relaxing. That is if she is still alive and not taken over by some monster. Now, I also know that I probably shouldn't have brought my phone with me, but I don't think that is how I was tracked. I think I was followed by this thing. I put the pedal to the metal and raced back home, running red lights and possibly leaving some collisions behind me. But I didn't care, because if I beat this thing home and saw my girlfriend, I could know that as long as she stayed in my line of sight. She is safe, but if she's not there, then I need to run as quickly as possible. I pulled up to the driveway and raced up to my front door. I unlocked it and was welcomed by a house of silence. My gut began sinking like water in oil. I shut the door and called out for her, but got no response. I headed to our bedroom, and it was about as disheveled as when I ran. My heart beating out my chest, my head throbbing, shoulders tensing from stress. I began focusing on each step as I inched my feet toward the spare bedroom. I opened the door to the bedroom and it looked about right. I opened the guest bedroom closet and gasped. There was no Lucille, but there was the skin of the waiter. No bones, no organs, no blood. No hair, just skin. The skin, other than the scalp, was all intact, just like how a normal person would have their skin positioned without organs holding it together. It was a skin suit. As I was staring at the flesh of some poor victim of being in my vicinity, I heard the door smash open. It was my girlfriend's voice, so I hid in the closet as I pulled up our doorbell camera on my phone. I don't know what that was, but it wasn't Lucille. That is for damn sure. It's still calling out for me. As I am hiding in this closet, what should I do? Someone please help me. I am terrified and I don't want to become a skin suit. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.